This cover page practically screams May 1997, back when the magazines were desperate to convince us that Blast Core, essentially a digital stress relief tool for heavy plant operators, was the absolute pinnacle of console gaming. There it is, taking up half the space like a bulldozer through a retirement home, demanding you pay attention. They're also peddling strategies for wave race and advice on finally putting Super Mario 64 to bed. It's a quaint little snapshot of a simpler era, when the N64 still felt shiny and new, and we hadn't yet realized how much of our lives would eventually be consumed by these cartridges. The next page splits focus between a moody Konami ad for International Superstar Soccer and editor Jonathan Davies' maiden welcome spiel. Konami leans heavily into the tired England versus Germany rivalry, using shadows to inject manufactured drama into pixelated football. Opposite, Davies asserts N64 Magazine's independence, vowing to endure every punishing game so readers won't have to. He waxes lyrical about the physics of Blast Core and the technical marvel of Wave Race 64, setting the tone. A publication aiming to be as swaggering and aggressive as the console's growing library. A classic, bold 1997 opening. This page lays out this month's agenda, heavily dominated by heavyweights like Wave Race 64 and Blast Core. There are guides for Turok and Mario 64. Bless the reviewers trying to help us grab those elusive stars without tearing our hair out. They've also listed FIFA 64, which they rightfully skewer as a footballing travesty. Let's face it, that game was an absolute car crash. Beyond a history lesson on Nintendo's humble card-making days, it's mostly just staff bios, proving the poor lot aged a decade trying to wrangle this early N64 library. The next page drops us squarely into the blood-soaked, adrenaline-pumping, pixel-dense corridors of Doom 64. If you think you knew Doom, you're kidding yourself. This isn't some bargain bin port knocked up on a weekend by an intern who'd never held a controller before. No, this is clearly the real deal, a bespoke effort designed to drag us kicking and screaming into the late 90s. It's arguably the most atmospheric and polished rendition of the franchise that graced a living room back then, and honestly, you can almost smell the ozone and brimstone radiating off the page. What's brilliant here is how the team isn't just treating this as another simple arcade shooter. They're genuinely impressed by the sheer craft involved. We've moved beyond the raw, jittery aesthetic of the earlier incarnations. Doom 64 is playing a different game, focusing on an unnerving, deliberate build-up of suspense that puts you right on edge before you even fire a shot. The monsters themselves, popping in from thin air, lend the game a sinister, otherworldly vibe that was genuinely unsettling at the time. It turns the simple act of exploring a dark corridor into a nervous, finger-hovering on the trigger affair, rather than the mindless blastathon some of the less inspired entries devolved into. You have to credit the controls too. The review touches on how the analog stick changed everything. Back in the day, attempting to line up a shot on a flat D-pad felt like trying to perform surgery with oven mitts on. Here the movement is smooth enough that when you are backing into a corner, unloading a hail of hot lead into some hulking beast, you feel like you're actually in control of your destiny, rather than just fighting the game's limitations. It's that sweet spot of responsiveness, giving us the precision needed for those frantic firefights, while letting us navigate those labyrinthine, multi-level arenas that made mapping secrets in Doom so dangerously addictive. And look at the visuals. The developers clearly squeezed every last ounce of juice from the console's engine to make it pop. You've got distinct, moody lighting effects and environments that finally felt solid, rather than like cardboard cutouts standing on a grid. The weapons too. Take a good look at the plasma rifle imagery here. It doesn't just look punchier, it feels like it holds weight. You get that reassuring buzz of the weapon firing, that feedback that reminds you exactly why you invested in this hardware in the first place. The folks writing this piece were clearly buzzing about the shift toward proper, dedicated console development, rather than getting sloppy seconds of existing PC games. It's hard to blame them for the enthusiasm. When you strip away the repetition, this feels like a refined, tighter, and altogether meaner beast that set the gold standard for what a shooter could do on a cartridge. Truly a solid, grim, and entirely satisfying addition to the library. Next we have a page that acts as a necessary, if somewhat condescending, survival guide for those of you currently suffering from directional dyslexia in the murky, industrial depths of the research lab. Where am I? It is the existential question that defines the entire experience, isn't it? It is not just a game level, it is an architectural migraine that Midway clearly thought was the height of intelligent design. You only need to glance at those red circles on the map. They are not merely points of interest, they are markers for every corridor where you will inevitably end up sprinting in frantic, confused circles, wondering if you missed a hidden wall switch or simply walked face first into a locked door because you lost your sense of direction years ago. The editorial team quite rightfully moves us on to the monster makeover, and frankly, it is about time. The creatures have finally managed to evolve from their flat, grainy, two-dimensional past. It is surprisingly amusing to see the imp, which previously looked like a somewhat disgruntled piece of papier-mâché, now boasting actual musculature and menace. And who could possibly disagree with their assessment of the cacodemon? They really do look like airborne, demonic red cauliflowers with an intense attitude problem. We have jumped from creatures that barely resembled organic matter to beasties that actually look like they would ruin your weekend if they caught you in a dark alley. Calling the Hell Knights plasma-firing teddies is a bit of cheek I quite appreciate, as if you would ever want to cuddle the hideous things before they decide to turn your internal organs into your external ones. Seeing the Mancubus hulking around within the console's dynamic lighting engine makes them look infinitely more imposing than their counterparts in the older PC entries. It's clear that even though the technology has improved, the design ethos remains the same. Force the player into a claustrophobic box, scare the wits out of them with lighting and sound, and then throw a wall of meat at them to see how they handle it. The real brilliance here is how the review touches on the "where am I" problem as if it's a positive attribute of the level design, rather than a frustrating exercise in tedious exploration. We weren't handed objectives back then, and we didn't have map markers leading us to victory by the nose. You were simply given a complex labyrinth that looked like a plate of angry spaghetti, and told to sort yourself out. It forces you to engage with the layout. If you wanted a guided experience, you would have bought something else. But here you are, crawling through a research lab, obsessively checking walls and hunting for keycards, just to progress a few measly rooms. But let's be honest, that distinct frustration, followed by the satisfaction of finally jamming the correct key into the door, is precisely why we put up with it. The mapping of the blue, yellow and red keys across such disjointed sectors is a bit sadistic, but at least the scenery you are dying in is now crisp, detailed, and utterly unforgiving. The next page presents us with a look at Konami's Ganbare Goemon, which would eventually bless our Western consoles as the brilliantly bizarre mystical ninja starring Goemon. Looking at these screenshots is like trying to explain a fever dream to someone who strictly plays serious military simulations. It is 1997, and the industry is currently undergoing a collective nervous breakdown, as every developer tries to force their perfectly good 2D franchises into the third dimension. While some studios created camera-unfriendly disasters, Konami, remarkably, managed to make the leap look intentional. There is a rather entertaining tension in the text here regarding the inevitable Super Mario 64 comparison. It is worth remembering that back in this era, if a game dared to exist in 3D and didn't feature a plumber in red overalls collecting stars, it was lazily labeled a clone. But look at this spread. Konami is clearly eager to distance itself from the status quo. While Mario was focused on acrobatics and jumping on sentient mushrooms, Goemon was offering feudal Japan smashed together with futuristic technology, gigantic mechs, and a level of narrative weirdness that no self-respecting Western studio would touch with a barge pole. The undisputed highlight here is the Goemon Impact section. When we discuss game design audacity, shoehorning a 60-foot, neon-glowing robot fight into a game about historical Edo Japan is sheer madness. But it is exactly the kind of unhinged creative energy the N64 library desperately needed. It successfully breaks up the monotony of the platforming exploration. We all remember the growing pains of early 3D, the camera issues, the draw distances, the struggle to gauge depth. But switching from playing as a pint-sized ninja to controlling a hulking slab of destructive metal offers a shift in scale that remains impressively inventive even by today's standards. The writers clearly get a kick out of the absurdity, referencing spells that cause bad perms and sidekick Ebisumaru's questionable flatulence dance. It is refreshing to see a title that refuses to take itself too seriously. After hours of grinding through pixelated, dark corridors in other titles, a game that unabashedly leans into such strange slapstick humor feels like a necessary palate cleanser. The game clearly knows exactly what it is, and it is aiming to entertain rather than merely impress us with technical specs. It captures that quintessential, head-scratching charm of Japanese gaming culture that hit our shores with such delightful irregularity. You aren't just here to stomp enemies, you are here to participate in a rhythmically ridiculous robot boss battle that feels like it fell straight out of a bizarre TV Sentai show. It is loud, it is colorful, and if this preview is anything to go by, it isn't just an attempt to mimic Nintendo's dominance, it is a confident effort to out-weird the entire genre. It really makes one wonder if we appreciated just how experimental developers were being before every title decided to pivot toward ultra-realism. The next page drags us straight into the cockpit of the most anticipated arcade-style blaster to grace our television screens, Star Fox 64. Before you get your knickers in a twist about the title, yes, they call it Star Fox 64 here. Despite the absolute administrative kerfuffle, the eventual name change to Lilac Wars would cause in our UK shops due to a copyright spat. The content is what matters. The magazine is pitching this like the second coming, and quite frankly, looking back, they weren't entirely wrong to be hysterical. For years, we endured the SNES era squinting at chirping, synthesized polygons, pretending that the digitized squawks emanating from our CRT screens actually meant something profound. Nintendo clearly realized we weren't just here to listen to gibberish chipmunks. Suddenly, we were promised full, audible speech, with drama, tension and Peppy actually giving us tactical advice, instead of just waiting to be pulverized by a stray asteroid. This preview captures that distinct, pre-release fever. They are practically salivating over the all-new maneuvers. Reading their breathless excitement over a simple barrel roll or a loop-de-loop is adorable now, knowing we would go on to treat those commands like sacred martial arts techniques, but at the time, seeing a vessel react so fluidly in 3D space felt like absolute witchcraft. Then, you've got the layout update. The writers are making a big deal out of the score indicators in the corner, and the fancy new 3D map system. It seems like such a pedestrian design choice now, but there was an entire year where simply having a camera that didn't snap your neck every time you banked left was a monumental engineering achievement. We were genuinely fascinated by the tech, that weird polygonal crunch that defines the mid-90s aesthetic. You look at these screens, with their angular bosses and deep space backgrounds, that look like they were painted by someone who had just discovered purple and black crayons, and you see the future. The highlight of the page is, undeniably, the promise of 4-player mayhem. We all spent far too many Saturday nights cramped on a living room floor, shouting at mates over screen peeking, and these screenshots make it look like a civilized gathering of intergalactic pilots. The editorial team describes the Landmaster levels on Titania with such seriousness, which is ironic, because controlling that bouncing, clunky brick across the sand was less about tactical superiority and more about enduring the sheer indignity of turning like a supermarket trolley with a flat tire. But, and here's the rub, we absolutely loved it. This page screams of an era where games were experimental, unrefined, and weirdly unapologetically fun. It wasn't about pushing ultra-realistic graphics or emotional storytelling, it was about flying a ship through a giant mechanical space gorilla, hearing some iconic catchphrases, and making sure your high score made it onto the cartridge memory before your sibling reset the console. You look at this spread and you see the foundation of 1,000 adolescent arguments, and for that we can't help but be impressed. The next page throws us headlong into the sweat, clamor, and neon-tinged enthusiasm of the Tokyo Game Show back in the spring of Goya, '97. Magazines of that era operated with this breathless urgency, seemingly desperate to claw every scrap of data out of Japan to show us what was on the horizon, resulting in those quintessential, grain-ridden photographs of TV screens that looked like they were captured through a layer of grease. The financial big money section tries to digest the industry landscape by comparing yen figures that ultimately read like someone trying to reassure investors that Nintendo hadn't already lost the war to Sony. While the report tries to spin a tale of corporate might, reading it now, one can sense the looming pressure. We were at the precipice where Nintendo had to prove that quality control could still keep pace with the massive flood of titles hitting their rival's system. Even that fleeting mention of the Donkey Kong television show serves as a stark reminder of that peculiar time, when everything was suddenly fully rendered and motion captured, despite it looking like a jagged pile of low-resolution plastic on our cathode ray tubes. But the games are where this page finds its soul. Castlevania 64, known then as Akumaju Dracula 64, gets a prominent shout, and you can practically hear the collective held breath of every gamer hoping for a mature, 3D masterpiece. Transplanting a whip-wielding vampire hunter into a third dimension was treated with all the seriousness of a scientific experiment. Seeing these screenshots of darkened, moody corridors and creatures creeping in the shadows promised that we were finally graduating beyond jumping on colorful mushrooms and into atmospheric, visceral thrills. Then there is Baku Bomberman. The challenge of taking a game built on perfect, grid-based purity and throwing it into a 3D plane was fraught with peril. The writers clearly saw promise in it, hyping it up as spruced up. But anyone who played those early transition-era platformers knows how clumsy camera controls often made such projects feel. It was an ambitious swing, certainly, But whether it landed as smoothly as the Japanese developers hoped was always a roll of the dice in those early days of analog control sticks. The page is littered with the usual experimental debris one expects from a trade show. We see titles like Aerogauge, which was essentially a "let's see if we can do what everyone else is doing" effort in the high-speed racer category, and a glut of niche, region-specific sports games that stood absolutely zero chance of ever touching a retail shelf here. It was a time when studios were frantically guessing what would work in 3D, creating a delightful mess of brilliant concepts and absolute duds that were doomed to remain local curiosities. You really get a sense of how wide open the market felt. No one knew what the rulebook was, so they were just writing it in real time. The next page takes a bleak, utilitarian dive into the world of third-party accessories. Here sits a gallery of essential kit, from cable upgrades to carry bags that screamed middle-aged travel rather than bedroom gaming. The true tragedy lies in the alternative controller's budget. Plasticky pretenders attempting to emulate the divine engineering of Nintendo's own Trident pad. Whether you were foolish enough to pay premium coin for an arcade shark or felt a desperate need to accessorize with an absolutely pointless branded wrist sweatband, it remains a somber testament to what players would buy when given enough spare cash and a misguided loyalty to random accessory manufacturers. Next, we find ourselves smack in the middle of a desperate, late 90s scramble. The magazine is effectively trying to manufacture excitement because the N64 was facing a bit of a dry spell, and clearly, somebody decided that any brawler that moved in 3 dimensions was a gift from the gaming gods. We were all staring at these screenshots with our faces pressed against the telly, genuinely hoping for the next great console fighter, despite the harsh reality that most of these attempts were about as smooth as dragging a chalkboard down a flight of stairs. First up is Mace, the Dark Age. It's almost quaint, isn't it? The preview promises a soul blade killer, flaunting its fully polygonal character models and, interactive, stages as if they were revolutionary breakthroughs. We're treated to a description of a cast, so, motley, an armor-clad knight, a Viking, a ninja, and assorted warlords. It reads like a tabletop role-playing game gone horribly wrong. It's quite charming in its ambition, really. Looking at it now, you can almost hear the developer praying that the N64's hardware would handle the textures without turning into a fuzzy, shimmering mess. They claimed it would bring flickering lighting effects and visceral action. We just hoped it wouldn't be as clunky as it inevitably turned out to be. Then, there's Dark Rift. Bless their little hearts, the folks at Vic Tokai. This one banked entirely on the allure of that magical phrase, 60 frames per second. It's the holy grail of fighting games, the promise that your inputs will be treated with dignity, rather than ignored by the game engine. The writers are trying hard to make this sci-fi aesthetic sound like the future of the genre, pointing out alien creatures and demonic designs. It looks appropriately moody, full of purples and harsh geometries, but let's be real. The gameplay usually boiled down to who could figure out the one broken move that actually connected properly. It's one of those titles you buy when you've already completed everything else worth owning twice over, just to say you've dabbled. And of course, no conversation about 3D fighting was complete without the shadow of Mortal Kombat 4 and that cursed beast, Mortal Kombat Mythologies, Sub-Zero. You have to love the sheer, unbridled optimism of this preview. They mention the cinematic sequences, and the move to full 3D, as if it were a seamless evolution. What the writer neglects to mention, because, at the time, the hype hadn't quite worn off, is that Mythologies was effectively a punishment for the gamer. A side-scrolling platformer with turning radii that felt like piloting a tugboat, all to get a bit of background story on the icy ninja. It was torture disguised as action-adventure. It's hilarious reading these hype pieces decades later. They really thought Midway had solved the riddle of moving Scorpion and company into the 3rd dimension. We wanted it to be good, sure, but those of us who suffered through it know that, sometimes, tradition really is better left unbroken. Ultimately, these pages represent a moment where the N64 fanbase was clutching at straws, waiting for anything that wasn't Mario branded to give us that competitive fighting thrill. They sold it to us as Saturday Night Fever, but in reality most of us probably spent our Saturday nights fiddling with the controller, wishing the developers had just spent another 6 months in the shed polishing the combat instead of rushing these out the door to satisfy the quarter-end bottom line. This page is an absolute masterclass in late 90s desperation, showcasing that mid-decade scramble where anything that allowed you to button mash your way to victory was heralded as the second coming of the digital messiah. We are greeted with the optimistic headline, Saturday Fight Fever. Though if we are being honest with one another, most of these brawlers wouldn't have caused a fever, even if you were playing them inside a burning radiator. First on the chopping block is War Gods. The review itself barely tries to hide the scent of burning garbage. It's midway attempting to translate their arcade sensibilities into 3D, and the result is about as fluid as a brick wall in a hurricane. Looking back at it, we all remember that weird, jagged, low-polygon look that plagued early N64 fighting games. The feeling that your character was made of wet cardboard and had the turn rate of an oil tanker. The review admits people weren't queuing up for it, and that's a polite way of saying it was a title destined to gather dust on a shelf. Then, there's the awkward inclusion of Street Fighter 2. There is something deliciously misguided about even hinting at an N64 conversion back then. Trying to force gorgeous, sprite-based pixel art into the N64's cartridge architecture was a tall order, and let's face it, that console lived and breathed 3D polygons. The weird stretched textures were kind of its brand. Speaking of bizarre aesthetics, we have Clay Fighter 63 1/3. This one feels like someone tried to film a Monty Python sketch using leftover plasticine and an unhealthy dose of caffeine. It was a joke game that became a cult hit, largely because the options on the N64 were so thin on the ground. We spent entirely too much time laughing at the ridiculousness of characters like Boogerman, because, frankly, when your library lacks substance, you settle for the weird stuff. The claim that it brings something new to the table was really just code for, it's a bit funny, but don't expect actual gameplay mechanics. The real diamond in this heap of rubble is Body Harvest. Finally, a game that actually had a concept. Developed by DMA Design, the very same lads who eventually birthed the beast that is Grand Theft Auto, Body Harvest was effectively a pre-GTA testbed that nobody realized they were playing at the time. The concept of traveling through different time periods and using absolutely anything with an engine to stomp alien bugs was visionary. While the magazine talks about the keep out sign, those of us who spent time in it remember the pure joy of the open world scale, or at least, the attempt at it. It was leagues above the stiff combat of War Gods, even if it still struggled under the limitations of that blurry draw distance we all grew to begrudgingly accept. Finally, tucked away in the corner is Ed by Ubisoft. Looking at the screenshots, you get the distinct impression it was meant to be some kind of platforming affair with a French flair for quirkiness. It captures that quintessential N64, let's make it weird vibe, where developers weren't sure what the hardware could handle, so they just threw a character in an abstract room and hoped the color palette was bright enough to hide the seams. We all know how many of these smaller titles vanished into the ether, and looking at this, one wonders if it was for the best. Still, compared to another mediocre fighting clone, at least it tried something different. The next page hits us with the kind of aggressive environmental activism only a 90s ad campaign could muster, featuring a stark, brooding Turok, dinosaur hunter advertisement that laments the plight of pixelated dinosaurs, as if we hadn't spent our entire allowances for the distinct purpose of hunting them to extinction. A bit heavy on the moral posturing that, but the game itself remains an essential part of the early N64 lore. Turning to the reviews, we're faced with Extreme G and Baku Bomberman, proving that developers were throwing anything they could get their hands on into 3D. Probe Development's Extreme G, essentially a wipeout pretender, was an honest attempt at futuristic racing. Though let's be fair, half the time you were essentially playing as a smear of light trails while the frame rate threw a temper tantrum. It was the quintessential N64 arcade experience, blisteringly fast if you didn't look too closely at the wall textures. Then we have Baku Bomberman. The transition of Hudson Soft's Premier series into a third-dimension polygon landscape was ambitious, and dare we say, hit or miss. Converting the explosive, top-down strategy into a complex hub-world affair meant losing some of that tightly focused multiplayer punch we'd come to love. It was essentially the studio saying, let's see if we can hide the lack of hardware maturity with 3D gimmicks. It held potential, certainly, but you remember how fiddly those early 3D platformers could be, especially when depth perception was merely a suggestion, rather than a reliable game mechanic. Shifting over to the Planet 64 gossip column, it perfectly captures the frenzied atmosphere of the industry at the time. We were all clinging to the faintest rumors about Castlevania 64, the phantom game that was always 6 months away from changing our lives. The industry was full of these weird promises. Developers were essentially just shouting into the void, hoping the N64's technical architecture would be kinder to them than the rumors suggested. And look at the talk surrounding esports. They were practically the villains of the console market back then, and reading about them finally agreeing to develop games for the system sounds less like a triumph and more like a reluctant admission of defeat. Finally, Hexen, a title that tried to bring hub-style labyrinthine exploration to our living rooms. Bringing that Doom-style technical workload to a cartridge system was brave, but as anyone who braved the performance hitches knows, it often ran with all the grace of a malfunctioning tank. The ambition to push full 3D environments, complete with gargoyles and catacombs, was noble, yet it regularly tested the patience of anyone actually trying to complete the levels. It's funny looking back, we weren't just playing games back then, we were witnessing the experimental laboratory of console gaming, where the only requirement was to look somewhat polygonal and hopefully, with a bit of luck, function passably. The next page is a frantic exercise in investigative journalism concerning something that, in hindsight, was setting us all up for glorious heartbreak, the N64 DD edition of Mother 3, Chimera's Forest. Ah, the N64 DD. That mythical black box add-on that felt like a piece of lost alien technology promising to transform our console into a powerhouse of design, while mostly just occupying a space in the industry that felt like a well-kept secret. We were treated to these grainy, confusing screenshots featuring grotesque cyborg pigs and oddball characters, trying to convince ourselves it made perfect sense. Shigesato Itoi's name was thrown around like royalty, and even though the aesthetic was essentially bizarre nightmare fuel, we were convinced this was the pinnacle of what a console RPG could be. The article prattles on about suitably inscrutable storytelling and woodland atmosphere, but let's be honest, you didn't care about the plot nuance. You cared that it was an N64-bound sequel to Earthbound. It's hilarious looking back. We treated every Japanese development tidbit like a decrypted telegram from heaven, completely ignoring the fact that this specific iteration was essentially vaporware, destined to go through a decade of development hell before ever seeing the light of day. We were so desperate for a break from collecting stars that any blurred photograph of a polygon monkey felt like a breakthrough. Moving to the right, we're faced with the ultra release list and the eager waiting chart, which was really just code for, here are the games you'll be fruitlessly asking the local game store clerk about every weekend until you reach retirement. Seeing The Legend of Zelda 64 parked at the top spot, long before it was graced with the suffix Ocarina of Time, is just a raw snapshot of that specific 1997 brand of torture. We didn't need release dates, we needed evidence that Nintendo hadn't forgotten how to ship games. There's Star Fox 64, lurking just beneath it, bringing that promise of vibrating controller pack feedback and Lilat system glory, and of course, Goemon 64, which remained the undisputed champion of eccentric games that actually worked. The rest of the charts are equally telling, showing exactly how thin the pickings were. It's all Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, and sports titles just trading places in the top 5. It captures that unique N64 era malaise perfectly. You had one or two titans occupying all your free time, while simultaneously scouring import lists, desperately hoping to find some oddity that would justify the hardware purchase once the plumber finally ran out of stages. It wasn't about the lists or the tables. It was about feeding the insatiable hunger for software in a market that felt like a drought in between those glorious defining releases. This next page brings us into the Colosseum of public opinion, the arena. This is where games go to either thrive or suffer a rather humiliating public execution at the hands of the editorial board. It serves as the primary gatekeeper for our precious weekends, determining exactly which plastic cartridge is actually worthy of the pennies we saved from our paper rounds. We begin with the aquatic wonder that is Wave Race 64. To simply describe this as a racing game feels like a disservice. At the time, that water shifting, flowing, and realistically undulating in a way that defied our collective understanding of graphical boundaries, was arguably the singular reason you bought the console in the first place. Seeing those waves move meant realizing that 3D gaming had finally, definitively moved beyond the awkward adolescence of earlier hardware. It was responsive, tight, and provided that distinctive rush of speed that simply could not be found on competing machines. The editor's mention of wearing a rubber wetsuit to play it? Honestly, I find that entirely plausible for this magazine's editorial staff. It's the sort of commitment to immersive, slightly unhinged journalism that defined a period, even if I pity the HR department that had to process such reports. Then, we have the mechanical genius that is Blastcore. Leave it to the wizards at Rare to look at a premise that sounds remarkably dull on paper, escorting a transport truck while casually demolishing entire city blocks and turning it into an addictive masterpiece of digital carnage. It's frantic, tight, and tests your spatial awareness more than anything else on the market. The tension of managing the clock while navigating through levels of urban ruin makes you feel like a one-man construction crew with a personal vendetta against architecture. It was creative, deeply rewarding, and solidified Rare as the undisputed architects of our platforming and puzzle-solving dreams. However, the mood shifts violently when we stumble across FIFA 64. Oh, what an absolute disaster that was. In an age where we were desperate for a proper football title to actually mimic the sport, Electronic Arts dropped this blocky eyesore into our laps. To have a game immediately branded as a disaster and relegated to the proverbial plumbing in the first issue it hits, suggests that EA wasn't exactly putting their best foot forward. It's an exercise in profound disappointment that makes you wonder if the developers had ever even seen a football in motion. That is exactly why the guide to scoring featured here is so vital. It keeps standards impossibly high, and ensures that when developers fail, they hear about it in no uncertain terms. Finally, they sprinkle in mentions of imports like Doraemon and Human Grand Prix, just to show they have the sophisticated international contacts we clearly lack. Seeing these tiny reviews reminds us that for those of us sitting in our living rooms, these games were entirely out of reach, existing only to tell us how small our market was compared to the giants over in Japan. It's a teasing, taunting glimpse at a gaming world we weren't invited to participate in, unless you particularly enjoyed the administrative nightmare of hunting down regional adapters just to see what you were missing out on. Next we have a glossy double-page spread, attempting to drown us in hype. The water is lovely obviously, but we've seen enough. Can we admit the jet ski sales pitch is excessive? The next page drags us firmly back into the wet stuff, drowning in the kind of hyper-detailed advice that made this specific magazine indispensable when the internet was little more than a glint in an engineer's eye. We are looking at the essential rundown of Wave Race 64, and honestly, the level of scrutiny the editorial team gave this game borders on the obsessive. It's almost charming how seriously we took these mechanics back in '97. Here the text dissects game modes like it's briefing pilots for a fighter jet, but let's be real. This was about as close as most of us would ever get to the sea, bar a wet bank holiday in Skegness. The championship mode is rightfully positioned as a bit of a grind. They act as if negotiating those buoys is a noble skill-based craft. While technically true, most of us just spent our formative years swearing at the screen because the wave physics had a mind of their own, often deciding that you should be doing a backflip into the barrier rather than hitting that vital checkpoint. Speaking of, the stunt mode blurb hits the nail on the head regarding Nintendo's design philosophy. They truly were obsessed with convincing everyone that the analog stick was the greatest invention since sliced bread. And credit where it's due, feeling the weight and lean of the jet ski was something entirely fresh for the time. It made the console feel worth every penny of that initial investment. Then we descend into the minutiae of Sunny Beach. Calling it an uneventful oval layout is the perfect kind of understated, cynical critique. It was a glorified car park, yet look at the energy expended explaining the draft mechanics as if you're pulling a tactical maneuver in Formula One. It's hilariously transparent. They needed to fill pages and look expert, so they gave us tips on how not to hit the land, which really just meant, try to look like you know what you're doing. The bits about the rider customization are peak 1997, aren't they? Giving you the choice between Ayumi Stewart and Ryota Hayami felt like a genuine strategic decision. We all acted like we were professional jet ski adjusters, tweaking the handling and grip to squeeze an extra fraction of a second out of a lap time, when in reality, it just came down to who could spam the turbo without falling off the edge. It's an odd little time capsule, really. Reading through this stuff highlights just how singular our focus was on titles like this. Wave Race wasn't just a game, it was the demonstration of the N64's potential. If the water looked this good, we thought, imagine what everything else would look like later. We were essentially holding the developers to account for every ripple and spray particle, and in retrospect, they really did deliver the goods. It's hard to stay angry about the unforgiving hitboxes on the buoys when you recall how groundbreaking that initial run across the water surface actually felt. They really did sell us a dream, and surprisingly, we bought it, hook, line, and sinker. The next portion of this magazine reads like a classified military brief for a maritime tactical operation, rather than a bit of fun with Nintendo's flagship water racer. We find ourselves dissecting the layouts of Sunset Bay and Drake Lake, and the editorial team is completely obsessed with these buoy rules, aren't they? They speak about the perfect slalom, with the kind of gravitas usually reserved for international diplomacy. Let's be honest, none of us were mastering these hairpin turns after a bit of a Friday night shindig. Missing a single slalom buoy meant losing your turbo and feeling the immense, crushing weight of failure as your jet ski puttered along like a rusted-out Ford Fiesta while everyone else rocketed ahead. It's absolutely brutal, that. Then we're treated to these ludicrous personality profiles for the riders, which really highlights the desperation to inject lore into what are essentially just different stat configurations. Miles Jeter, with his penchant for technical precision, and Big Wave Dave, mariner, whose biography insists he comes from a bizarre non-Euclidean dimension. Honestly, were the developers just eating magic mushrooms while drafting these manuals? Nobody actually cared about the helmet aesthetics. We just wanted to know which character was least likely to bounce off the water like a dropped pebble. But in 1997, You'd sit there reading this drivel, completely convinced that choosing the rider with the extra handling stat was a strategic masterclass rather than a toss-up between slightly different colors. Floating on over to Drake Lake, we encounter the Mist, which the text frames as some grand challenge to be conquered through sheer technical mastery. The guide calls it a buoy-scraping good time, but in reality, it was just the game developers' clever way of limiting our sightlines, so they didn't have to render the rest of the world. Calling out 3D Death Crash is exactly the kind of cheek the journalists at the time loved, clever phrasing to fill whitespace while telling you, quite literally, how to avoid slamming into a post on the final lap. The amount of ink spilled over tuning engines and handling is a particular highlight. Changing your setup by a few bars promised you'd be a king of the waves, when really, it offered a change so minuscule, only a cyborg could tell the difference. We would sit there for an hour, treating the selection screen like a workshop for Formula One vehicles, desperately trying to shave 3 milliseconds off our lap times. We weren't experts, of course. We were just kids sat far too close to flickering television sets, aggressively thumbing an analog stick until our digits ached, completely hoodwinked by the gorgeous water physics into believing we were part of an elite sports federation. It's hard to stay angry at the absurdity of it all, though. The water ripple effect back then genuinely made the rest of the 3D gaming world look like a mud bath. The next page takes us deeper into this bizarre, watery world where, apparently, you're not just a person on a jet ski, but a hardened maritime strategist managing a high-octane nautical conflict. We are dissecting the nuances of Marine Fortress and Port Blue as if we're plotting out a major naval invasion, rather than trying not to bin it into a concrete bollard on our time off. Marine Fortress, what a grand name for a course that, in practice, was mostly about learning not to smack into the iron gates before they inevitably slammed shut in your face. The guide prattles on about storm-laden skies, and the unrelenting riptide like the writers are reporting from the middle of a genuine shipwreck. If you weren't slamming that accelerator at exactly the right microsecond during the start, you might as well have packed it in. Trying to thread the needle through those narrow gaps while avoiding debris feels like the magazine expects us to be performing precision naval navigation. The actual gameplay, of course, involved a frantic, clumsy, rhythmic mashing of the controller, usually followed by an embarrassing tumble into the brine. Then there's Port Blue. The magazine's focus on the hazards here is genuinely hilarious. That helicopter buzzing overhead, which we were led to believe was a looming, constant threat, as if the authorities were personally concerned with our illicit racing through these industrial shipping lanes, is the quintessential example of 90s gaming melodrama. They go into painstaking detail on how to perform a double flip, treating it like a textbook maneuver you'd see at the Olympics. In reality, most of us would try to execute that fancy jump, mistime the motion by a fraction, and end up nosediving into the water like a sack of damp flour. And don't even get me started on their advice for navigating the tunnels. They talk about it like it's an architectural critique of the port's sewage infrastructure, rather than a high-speed sprint, to avoid losing your standing. It reads as though there's an optimal path for every centimeter of the track, assuming you aren't fighting the controller inputs because you're sat 3 inches from a flickering tube television. It's all perfectly captured, though. These diagrams, the intense technical breakdowns, and the best time boxes were catnip for anyone who took their console too seriously in 1997. We were chasing milliseconds on tracks that looked like works of art compared to anything else on the market, absolutely convinced we were professional pilots instead of bored teenagers at home. It's wonderfully pretentious nonsense, and we loved every bit of it. This page plunges us headfirst into the moody, neon-lit ambience of Twilight City and the shivering, friction-deprived nightmare that is Glacier Coast. We're moving away from the industrial ports and into terrain that frankly requires the hands of a neurosurgeon, provided that surgeon spends their weekends launching a jet ski over floating obstacles while being aggressively judged by the scenery. Twilight City, the publication insists, is a cool, dark evening ramp fest. That's a lovely, poetic way of describing a track that felt more like trying to reverse a transit van through a London side street during rush hour after a few pints. The writers here genuinely want us to believe there's a sophisticated line through those minefields, treating these routes like top-secret, high-stakes tactical schematics reserved for international espionage. If you actually managed to navigate those narrow gaps while avoiding the iron fences and executing a submarine dive without slamming into the concrete at full speed, then you weren't just playing a video game, you were probably overqualified for a real-life maritime job. Of course, the reality for most of us, despite the magazine's grandiose technical analysis, was staring at the water physics in absolute slack-jawed awe because, in 1997, that was the most liquid-looking substance anyone had ever witnessed on a home console. The guide treats the game's handling as a rigid set of scientific laws. Back in our lounge rooms, however, it was mostly frantic, sweaty-palmed flailing, trying to wrestle that strange N64 analog stick into submission, as the jet ski decided it would rather drift aimlessly into the horizon than turn a corner. Then we slide over to Glacier Coast, a course Nintendo's developers presumably cooked up solely to ruin our afternoon. This level was arguably the ultimate litmus test for whether you had truly mastered the handling, or if you were just fluking your way through the Grand Prix. The tip here is especially cheeky. They described the spin-out flats with the sort of detached, scholarly expertise one might reserve for an Arctic survival guide, suggesting we should veer hard right and essentially fight our natural gaming instincts to navigate the ice. Feels like a proper mental trap, designed to send us careening off the track at the first opportunity. And don't even get me started on the mention of pulling off triple flips. Recommending complex gymnastics implies we weren't all just desperately holding A and hoping the laws of physics didn't throw us into a snowbank while our mates laughed. There is a bizarre, endearing quality to these diagrams littered with arrows and red scribbles. We sat inches away from our bulky televisions, absorbing this advice like it was ancient scripture, completely convinced that these professional tips were the only thing separating us from aquatic greatness. It perfectly captures the mindset of the era, treated with absolute, deadpan seriousness, analyzing lines on a screen as if we were prepping for the Olympics rather than having a laugh on the weekend. It is absurdly pretentious nonsense, yet it was precisely the kind of content that kept us locked into Wave Race 64 long after our thumbsticks had gone floppy from the wear and tear. Next we have an analysis of the Southern Island track, the quintessential first hurdle for any N64 pilot. Looking at these charts is akin to observing a tactical schematic for a clandestine naval mission rather than a cheery, sun-soaked jet ski race. The publication goes all out with its academic approach, breaking down the line as if the developers' basic geometry were some ancient sacred script handed down from a higher power. It is properly droll to think of us sitting inches from our boxy CRT televisions, sweating bullets while trying to angle our little digitized skis perfectly to pass under a pier, all while acting as though we were master navigators rather than just kids fumbling with an analog stick that had been aggressively flicked in too many heated races. The magazine is borderline insulting with its expert tone, acting as though every mistake was an avoidable oversight due to our total lack of professional focus. Note the obsession with the EA, maximum power, boys. Getting that constant feedback loop of acceleration was satisfying, sure, but here they frame it like it's nuclear physics. You can practically hear the smugness of the reviewer as they break down the tangibility of the underwater assets, teaching us how to exploit collision detection by diving through dock pilings. They make it sound like this knowledge is vital for human survival, completely ignoring the fact that half the joy of the game was accidentally bouncing off scenery because you couldn't be bothered to execute a perfect turn. They even take a delightfully cynical dig at players searching for the free lunch cheat, basically telling us to go have a word with ourselves if we're relying on such low-rent tricks. That specific, condescending charm mocking your characters, tacky aesthetics and implying you shouldn't come crying to the manual just because you're useless at handling the waves, is precisely why we read these. They treated every pixelated jump as if it were a high-stakes arena, where professional glory was at stake. Looking at the detail in these screenshots, the light refraction on the water surface, which was proper black magic in 1997, you begin to understand the reverence. The text attempts to lecture us on hydrodynamic theories and tidal channel movement, yet deep down we all know it was a messy, wet, glorious affair that frequently resulted in slamming face first into a wooden post because we miscalculated the depth. It is brilliantly absurd just how seriously they treated what was, essentially, a fun weekend distraction. The next page treats us to a forensic dissection of FIFA 64, and reading through it, the vibe is unmistakably clear. This title was a bit of a damp squib. One can imagine the collective excitement building for a polished football experience on the hardware, yet the reality presented here confirms that the hope for a top-tier sporting simulation quickly curdled into genuine frustration. The magazine is ruthless in its critique, and it hits the nail on the head. That penalty system? A proper nightmare. One is meant to be in control during the most high-stakes moment in a match, yet the mechanics were so disastrously random that playing them felt like tossing a coin in a gale. There was no finesse, just button-mashing desperation and a prayer that the game engine wouldn't force the striker to sky the ball into orbit. It's easy to look back now and wince at how infuriating that level of inconsistency was. No one wants their victory determined by the whims of a confused piece of code. Then we have the pacing. Players expected slick, flowing transitions, but instead they got gameplay that moved with all the urgency of a Sunday league game in a quagmire. It is genuinely baffling how infuriatingly slow the match engine could be, making every pass and sprint feel like a monumental struggle against the console itself. One could almost feel the heavy, plodding rhythm radiating from the CRT, as one desperately tried to force some semblance of flair out of those pixelated teams. And surely, everyone remembers the annoyance of that picture-in-picture screen nonsense? Instead of delivering some cutting-edge tactical vision, it essentially took the small viewing area we had and blocked half of it with a tiny, grainy view that no one asked for and even fewer used. It's the hallmark of design decisions that weren't quite thought through, cluttering the limited screen space we had, rather than simply refining the primary perspective. The tone of this review is essentially a sympathetic, if blunt, autopsy of a title that promised the world and delivered very little of substance. It takes the mickey out of the confused menus and the lack of decent input responsiveness, capturing the general disappointment of anyone who spent their hard-earned cash hoping for greatness. It stands as a prime example of an early generation title that was simply out of its depth, offering us not the beautiful game, but rather a chore wrapped in shiny branding. The next page provides a properly savage takedown of what the editors are cheekily calling Soccer 64, a clear shot across the bow at the lackluster FIFA 64. Watching the review unfold feels like watching a slow-motion car crash, though one you can't help but stare at given how much it manages to miss the mark. The critique focuses entirely on the goalkeeper AI, or the baffling absence thereof. They've provided a brilliant frame-by-frame breakdown that really hammers home just how incompetent the code was. The keeper behaves more like a disinterested spectator at a Sunday morning park match than an elite professional, frequently watching the ball sail past his nose like it's an inconvenient gnat he's too lethargic to swat. One can vividly recall the general mood during these early days for the system. There was a desperate hunger among players for a top-tier sporting title that actually made use of the hardware's power, but instead, we kept getting served up these unpolished, sluggish monstrosities. The reviewer, Peter Spilton, deserves credit for having the nerve to drop the hammer with a 39% rating. That's a stinging rebuke, effectively warning us that the product is a chore wrapped in shiny, recognizable branding. It highlights the precise type of early generation struggle, where the engine could barely handle the simplest interactions, turning what should have been fluid, tactical play into a slog through virtual mud. It really speaks volumes about the disconnect at the time between high-profile licensing and actual software quality. The writer's snark is palpable, and frankly, quite refreshing. It saves anyone with a tight budget from making the mistake of trusting a title based solely on its name. The consensus here is quite clear. Don't touch it unless you're keen on viewing a technical comedy of errors rather than an actual game of football. The right side of this spread is simply a standard, uninspiring full-page advertisement for gameplay, hawking cut-price consoles and software to anyone with a spare wallet and a misplaced sense of optimism. Next, we have a sharp left turn from the unmitigated disaster on the previous page. We're moving from the sluggish, laughable excuses for sports simulations directly into the arms of Rare, who, back in '97, could seemingly do no wrong. They handed us Blast Corps, a title that makes the sheer, unbridled destruction of urban infrastructure look like a necessary civic duty. Let's face it, most of us were getting pretty fed up with the early cycle filler. You'd pick up a new cart, load it into your grey plastic beast, and half the time you were just testing whether your frame rate was dropping out of sheer spite. Then along comes Blast Corps, a premise so simple yet deliciously rewarding that it makes you wonder why every other developer was wasting our time. Your instructions are effectively, there is a broken, leaking nuclear missile carrier wandering about town, and you are the only one with enough vehicular heavy ordnance to turn entire suburbs into a nice clear path. It's an exercise in logic and speed, disguised as an episode of a Saturday morning cartoon. Back in these days, seeing the import arena tag was a mixture of genuine excitement and sheer wallet-draining terror. We were living through a time where you either sat on your hands for a year, hoping for a local conversion that wouldn't run in slow motion with giant black bars, or you grabbed a Japanese import, stumping up 6,800 yen, which felt like a small fortune for a student just to experience the hardware properly, was a rite of passage for the serious enthusiast. This wasn't some slow-loading RPG with dialogue walls, this was immediate, satisfying, polygon-smashing joy. The magazine is absolutely spot on with its assessment here, even giving it the Star Games seal of approval. It's easy to look back now and praise Rare, But in the moment it was genuinely refreshing to have a game that didn't just look the part but actually played with such distinct mechanical confidence. You're juggling vehicle switches, precision, and that looming pressure of a game-ending explosion. It manages that tricky balance of making you feel like a one-man wrecking ball, all while keeping the puzzle element front and center, so you don't just get distracted by the lovely pyrotechnics. It is the antithesis of that cynical license-first style of development we saw with games like FIFA, where those titles relied on the logo on the box to sell copies. Blastcore relies on the engineering. It is one of those rare titles that convinced us that despite all the early hardware hiccups and the long, arid droughts of software, the machine sitting under our televisions actually had the power. It is an absolute cracker of a title that demanded your full attention, provided you had the patience to get a Japanese import shipped over. The next page dives headfirst into the motley collection of hardware that makes Blastcore less of a driving game and more of a frenzied, demolition-fueled nightmare. Rare didn't just give us a car and point us at a target, they gave us a logistical headache on wheels, and this page effectively serves as the driver's manual for potential disaster. If you take a look at the rundown for the heavy hitters, the ramdozer, the sideswipe, the backlash, it really puts into perspective how these vehicles demanded distinct handling styles. There was nothing more humbling in the mid-90s than watching a screen of flickering, gorgeous pixels and realizing you'd completely flubbed a perfectly good run because you didn't quite master the drifting maneuver of a dump truck. And let's be fair, watching the backlash skidding about sideways into a building isn't just gameplay, it's high art. It was that distinct, tactile feel that convinced us all that the controller developers at Nintendo were onto something clever, and Rare was clearly reading from the same hymn sheet. The highlight of the lineup, for my money, remains the mechanical marvels like Thunderfist and J-Bomb. You see a hulking great piece of machinery, you think it's going to be a slog, but instead, it performs the architectural equivalent of a belly flop, stomping things into the ground. Seeing a massive, souped-up exosuit perform a somersault over a residential district remains a peculiar high point of N64 history. It's gloriously over the top, much like the game's premise of requiring total annihilation of a village to prevent a runaway nuclear-leaking freighter from detonating. The sanity levels at the local council clearly plummeted in this universe. The extra vehicles sidebar provides that quintessential gaming help we all leaned on to, listing out everything from boats and cranes to those largely ceremonial, joyriding helicopters. It was comforting to have the distinction made, specifically for the times you accidentally hopped into a transport unit, expecting a wrecking ball, and realized too late you were driving into a mission-critical water crossing. The writers back then really captured that granular requirement of, know your equipment or go home. Overall, this isn't just a list of stats, it's a survival guide for those of us trying to gold medal every mission. Even when the game gets genuinely punishing and you find yourself retrying that final mission for the 20th time, there is a technical integrity here that makes every failure feel entirely personal. Whether you were mastering the delicate, twitchy handling of the ballista, or brute-forcing your way through suburbia with the ramdozer, it felt like Rare had essentially mapped out exactly how to make industrial machinery feel responsive and rewarding. And really, that's all anyone wants from their console at the end of the day, a way to feel useful by tearing it all down. This page essentially functions as a how-to for preventing catastrophe, assuming your idea of rescue involves tearing down the entire infrastructure of a fictional township. We have moved past the garage inventory and are now in the thick of the actual gameplay loop. And truthfully, watching how Rare expected us to scramble through these early levels is rather eye-opening. The mission walkthroughs on display highlight that delightful tension Rare loved to employ, balancing strict logistics against the brute force requirement of wrecking absolutely everything in your path. It is charming, really, how Mission 1 tries to teach us the fundamentals, hopping from a train, finding a bulldozer, and dealing with crates of explosives as if we were defusing a delicate bomb rather than just smushing boxes to bits. It paints the perfect picture of why Blastcore felt so satisfying. You weren't just causing destruction for sport, you were playing a high-stakes, clock-ticking logic puzzle where the penalty for failure was nuclear fallout. Then there is that snippet about the cyclone suit. Giving a robot with a mind of its own a series of acrobatics-based objectives was peak N64-era character design. It sounds less like a game, and more like herding a particularly uncooperative toddler through a gymkhana course. The highlight of the spread, however, is that sidebar on the right concerning the Japanese import market. This is a topic that resonates deeply for anyone who spent the mid to late 90s trying to hunt down games months ahead of their domestic releases. Back then there was this mythos surrounding Japanese imports. We would willingly trudge down to the independent video game shops, the ones that smelled of carpet cleaner and cigarette smoke and pay inflated prices just to get our hands on the Japanese box art. Speaking of the art, it's a brilliant comparison they've made here. Rare, in their infinite wisdom, seemingly couldn't grasp why Nintendo Japan decided the best marketing for an explosion-filled demolition game involved plastering a completely random girl's face on the cover, instead of showcasing the high-octane spectacle of mechanical vehicles smashing into high-rises. It is a fantastic juxtaposition that highlights how differently gaming culture was being pitched globally. While the Western packaging had to cater to the juvenile desire for big, fiery shapes to ensure we knew exactly what the objective was, Japan clearly took a much more surreal approach to box design. It captures that distinct period of discovery where you would buy a game and half the fun was deciphering why on earth it looked so radically different from what you were used to, knowing full well the gameplay would likely baffle you even further. Rare made a masterpiece. And whether you imported it or bought it on the high street, we all ultimately learned that driving heavy plant machinery into buildings is perhaps the finest use of a Saturday afternoon. The next page, well, actually a double-page spread this time, drags us further into the minutiae of Blast Corps. By this point in the spring of '97, Rare was basically holding the N64 by the throat, churning out titles that defined the console's identity. You look at these tips on finding those hiding scientists and collecting radiation dispersal units, RDUS, and you can almost smell the burnt circuits of an overworked console grinding through the data. Honestly, looking at these guides is a mental exercise in itself. The scientists' levels are pure classic Rare, aren't they? It's not enough that you saved the day and averted nuclear Armageddon. You've got to scurry about behind shipping crates to find hidden chaps, because Rare arbitrarily decided that's the only way to secure a gold medal. It's a wonder our controllers survived, given how often these extra objectives demanded pixel-perfect precision on a dwindling timer. It wasn't enough to just clear the road. You had to play, fail, and restart until you became a one-person demolition machine with no life to speak of. And who can forget the moon levels, or rather, who can forget the absolute annoyance of low gravity? Rare tossed the standard physics engine out the window, effectively gave the vehicles ice skates, and called it a bonus stage. It is proper mental stuff. Yet in that strange, distinctly mid-90s Nintendo way, we swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. The shift from driving heavy, sensible plant machinery on Earth to the absurdity of leaping around on extraterrestrial surfaces perfectly encapsulated why Rare had the industry in a headlock at the time. They didn't care if the mechanics were occasionally nonsensical, provided they were entertaining. Now looking at the actual review text, there is some refreshingly brutal honesty concerning the vehicle handling, specifically the backlash. Thank goodness someone finally went on the record about it. Trying to execute a precise move with that specific machine was less about strategic demolition and more about battling an interface clearly designed to punish you for even daring to touch the thumbstick. Maneuvering it usually ended in total catastrophe, sending you ricocheting off scenery like a pinball in a state of sheer panic. The final verdict of 88% feels exactly right for the time. It is not technical perfection, largely due to those infuriating vehicle quirks and the head-scratching absence of a proper two-player multiplayer mode, which would have been perfect for this sort of arcade-style carnage. However, the review hits the nail on the head regarding the spectacle. It was never really about photorealism. It was about the raw joy of flattening entire zip codes while the machine struggled to keep up with the polygon count. Cheers, Rare, for making us work for every single medal while pretending we were legitimate professional civil engineers, rather than just hooligans with a taste for controlled demolition. This page presents a sobering reminder of the desperation we felt as early N64 adopters. With local releases often lagging behind, we relied on the import shops featured here Excitement Direct and Project K to get our fix. These advertisers were essentially the gatekeepers of our gaming hobby before international availability eventually caught up. As for the review, we find ourselves staring at Doraemon by Epoch. This title is a peculiar, slightly misguided effort that looks at Super Mario 64 and attempts to capture that same lightning in a bottle, only to discover the bottle was already shattered. Watching the reviewer dish out a 60% verdict feels almost polite, given how utterly disjointed the experience seems to be. There is a certain tragic hilarity in importing a Japanese title about an iconic, robotic, earless cat, realizing the game controls with the grace of a rusted shopping trolley, and then attempting to play it in a language one presumably cannot read. Surely, we all recall those distinct weeks where any software, good, bad, or utterly bewildered, was treated like a holy relic, simply because it filled a slot on the console. Doraemon clearly thought it was onto something by mimicking the structure of Miyamoto's masterpieces, but it misses the fundamental spark. The reviewer's gripes about movement are, quite frankly, justified. You can forgive a platformer for having a few edges that aren't smoothed out, but when the fundamental act of running becomes an endurance test, the designers have lost the plot. The magazine mentions that finding hidden objects and completing mundane tasks is the main hook, which sounds less like an epic adventure and more like being given chores for digital reward points. The reviewer's note regarding the lawsuit-defying proximity to Nintendo's work is the highlight of the article. It really raises the question of whether the developers at Epoch were blind to the comparison, or if they were genuinely banking on the Japanese audience buying anything with that feline's face on it. Doraemon serves as a classic, mid-90s example of a studio getting ahead of their capability to craft something truly engaging. It sits firmly in that collection of imports we likely regret buying. The visuals are colorful, the world is vaguely interesting in a Nintendo clone sort of way, but it lacks the tactile joy of movement that kept us chained to the console. Ultimately, this title is a dull, hollow imitation that acts as a cautionary tale. Just because it runs on the machine, it doesn't mean it deserves the hardware's prestige. The next page dives headfirst into the desperate, slightly deranged mindset of early N64 owners who were essentially starving for anything resembling a driving simulation. We were all staring at our consoles, praying for a true, groundbreaking racer, and instead, we were greeted with Human Grand Prix. To be quite honest, this game represents that peculiar period in our collective gaming lives where we treated an imported, Japanese, slightly broken F1 game like it was the Holy Grail. It's a fascinating, albeit flawed specimen. If you look closely at the spread, you can feel the reviewers struggle. They've given it a 71% a score that, let's be fair, is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting. It's that classic journalistic dance of trying to be polite about a game that's fundamentally fighting you, while desperately hoping a better version of this genre turns up eventually. They mention that contract system as if it's a stroke of tactical genius, when in reality, it was just the developers padding out the lack of actual on-track excitement by making us juggle contracts and transfers between teams. It sounds terribly intellectual until you realize you're just clicking menus, hoping to land a seat that won't make you hate life the moment you take a corner. And the cornering. The sidebar highlight on the Monaco track is genuinely brilliant in its bleakness. It highlights every problem of early 3D console races. If your driving physics aren't spot on, tight street circuits turn into an exercise in pure frustration. The game boasts about its challenge, which is code for, you will spend 80% of your race colliding with invisible geometry and walls that pop into existence right before you hit them. Dealing with the pop-up and the twitchy steering was an absolute chore, yet we all played it. We learned the circuits by heart, not because it was rewarding, but because there simply wasn't a choice. It wasn't about the joy of racing, it was about the stubbornness of overcoming bad design. It is peak 90s cynicism at work. They highlight all these intricate details, the tire wear, the track conditions, but skip over the fact that if the actual experience of driving the car feels like guiding a wet bar of soap through a minefield, the realism hardly matters. Human Grand Prix really is the automotive equivalent of finding out the expensive meal you were promised is actually just lukewarm mash with a bit of garnish on top. We were young, we were hopeful, and we were quite happy to spend a small fortune importing mediocrity just because it came on a grey cartridge. You look at it now and wonder how we managed to get so much mileage out of it, but such is the power of a thirsty gaming audience. We didn't want okay or passable, we wanted glory, and we made do with what we had, even if what we had required the patience of a saint to keep on the track. This page acts as an emergency lighthouse for those wandering blindly through the initial levels of Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. Let's be fair, finding keys was rarely a leisurely stroll through the park. Back in 1997, Turok was the titan of the console, pushing the N64 hardware to its absolute brink. While the environmental fog was a convenient method for developers to hide a lack of draw distance, it did absolutely nothing to help us find those wretched keys. You were essentially squinting into a green-tinted haze, looking for small, nondescript objects that blended perfectly into the surrounding shrubbery. The magazine editors clearly knew exactly where we were struggling. A feature like this wasn't just a fun extra, it was practically an essential life support system for the player base. The guide walks you through the hub ruins, breaking down the hunt for 6 keys, and the elusive chronoceptor piece. Reading it now, you realize that the game didn't just ask you to have fast reflexes to dispatch velociraptors, it demanded you have the investigative persistence of a private detective just to navigate the layout. Most modern games coddle the player, painting glowing arrows on the floor or offering handy mission markers, but not this. We were left to poke around at flat walls and backtrack through respawning monstrosities, simply because we didn't hug the right pixel-textured bush in a maze. We all remember the irritation of standing in that hub, completely bewildered, while those blue teleporter portals stared at us mockingly because we lacked a single, obscure key. It's laughable to think that level designers decided these tiny collectibles should be the primary gatekeepers for progress. But that was the era everything had to be a hunt. Whether you were running tedious laps through cavernous, misty environments or desperately trying to time a jump for a ledge that seemed just barely out of reach, there was always a creeping doubt. Am I in the right spot? Usually the answer was hidden behind a generic rock or tucked into a corner we'd already walked past 6 times. The screenshots provided in this guide are pure, golden age treasure. The sheer audacity of presenting low-res images as crystal-clear navigation clues shows exactly how much we had to improvise with the print media of the day. You would study these shots, convinced you had found the path, only to realize you were entirely lost in a different quadrant of the level. And yet, there was an undeniable satisfaction to it. Collecting the full arsenal, particularly that final weapon piece, provided a rush that felt genuinely earned through sweat and thousands of wasted bullets. This spread was likely the difference between finishing the first stage in a reasonable time or spending your entire Saturday screaming at the television. You couldn't just open a YouTube walkthrough. We treasured these pages like holy scripture to keep our sanity intact. The next pages of this guide offer more lifeline material, dragging us out of the dense, green fog of Level 2 and straight into the maddening vertical architecture of the ancient city. By this point, the initial adrenaline of gunning down prehistoric creatures with oversized weaponry has likely given way to the deep, sinking feeling that the game designers were actively working against your enjoyment. The instructions are written with an air of, good luck with that, which, quite frankly, sums up the 1997 experience of exploring the N64's early blockbusters. Level 2 is basically a lesson in environmental humiliation. The map is designed with such subtle secrets like tiny darkened crevices under a tree or hard-to-spot ledges off the main cliff path that without these prints, you would spend days rotating your character in a desperate 360-degree sweep, hoping something finally pops. We have all experienced that unique level of misery, scouring the same 5-pixel patch of grass for a hidden opening while your ammo count steadily dwindles. Moving on to Level 3, the ancient city section turns from a hike into a high-stakes obstacle course. The guide mentions grotesquely unfair platforming sequences, and you remember those sequences only too well. Expecting a player to execute a precise, pixel-perfect jump on those crumbling stone pillars, all while using a joystick that felt like it had been wrestled by an actual T-Rex, was a borderline cruel design choice. It demands, as the magazine helpfully notes, superhuman patience. That is code for prepare to scream at your television because you missed the edge by a fraction of a millimeter. The layout of these pages, with their scrappy little yellow arrows drawn directly onto dark, blurry screenshots, provides a stark reminder of the era's limitations. You couldn't just scrub through a video online to see where you were going wrong. These printed arrows were the digital gospel. You held these pages with greasy fingers, cross-referencing a dark, pixelated image with the darker, even more pixelated image flickering on your bulky tube TV. What's hilarious to reflect on now is the sheer hunt for these chronoceptor pieces. The magazine treats the finding of these fragments as some grand, glorious discovery, conveniently glossing over the fact that they were usually tucked behind an obscure bush or inside a cavern that forced you to walk past every monster you had already defeated. But once you secured the piece, there was a fleeting moment of unbridled triumph. It wasn't just a collectible, it was validation that you weren't totally incompetent. The game challenged you, insulted your navigation skills, and then demanded you perform circus acrobatics just to get one step closer to the end. Looking at it now, the instructions are straightforward enough, but in the heat of the moment, surrounded by thick, fog-filled environments, these snippets were the only thing stopping most of us from trading the game in for store credit. It is a brilliant bit of journalism for an age when being lost was considered a standard gameplay feature rather than a developer error. This page sees us plowing further into the muddy, brown and grey depths of Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, as the guide drags us kicking and screaming through the labyrinthine delights of levels 4 and 5. By this stage in the game, you weren't just a Turok player. You were an expert in locating invisible doorways and pixel hunting for switches, while simultaneously praying your analog stick didn't commit suicide mid-jump. The ruins and the catacombs were, let's be honest, where the developers decided to stop caring about your sanity and started focusing on how much misery they could pack into a cartridge. Look at level 4. It promises a few nice surprises and twists, which is industry speak for, you're going to be underwater so much you'll grow gills. That entire sub-aqua sequence isn't so much exploration, as it is a lesson in extreme navigation with a foggy, murky, and utterly suffocating view. And those fire-topped pillars. Whoever decided platforming was the natural progression for a dinosaur-slaying shooter probably should have had a stern talking to from a union representative. We all recall the sheer faff of leaping from one flickering stone pillar to another, while a stray sprite looked in your direction one wrong input, and it was a splash into the abyss. It's glorious punishment in a format that really hasn't aged with much kindness, even if we swore by it back then. Then there's the catacombs. The guide calls it dark, dingy and depressing, and that is perhaps the most accurate gaming critique I have ever read. Level 5 was the moment the game threw its claustrophobic toys out of the pram. The level design becomes a confusing tangle of narrow, zigzagging corridors, designed exclusively to turn your map-reading brain into jelly. The advice here is typical of the time: just walk here, shoot that priest, press the switch. Easy in theory, but when you are dealing with enemies that seemingly had infinite range and the turning circle of a double-decker bus, those switch-activated doorways were the bane of our existence. You'd hit a switch, race to the door, realize you've hit the wrong one, and then spend 20 minutes wandering around a basement feeling thoroughly confused. The beauty, if you can call it that, is the way these guides were presented. That thick, childish yellow marker, scribbled onto a screenshot, is essentially a piece of 1997-era cartographic genius. In a pre-YouTube age, if this blurry photo didn't show you where the portal was, you were effectively retired from playing. It didn't matter how aggressive the game was, or how obscure the pathfinding. We worshipped these little yellow lines as if they were written in ancient scripture. That Chronoceptor hunt? Pure, concentrated masochism. You didn't just want the weapon. You wanted to finish the torture you'd bought for 50 quid, and for that, we were happy to suffer. It's funny how we fondly recall the misery of the game as if it were a high art difficulty, rather than a lack of navigational signage, but that's the N64 for you, always making you work for your 5 seconds of satisfaction. The next page drags us, somewhat unceremoniously, into the dizzying sky-high perils of Treetop Village, which is essentially just an excuse for the developers to see how many times they could make a player plummet to their death. We are knee-deep in the Turok experience here, where the level design logic is clearly based on the idea that if you aren't forced to jump into a murky, featureless abyss at least twice a minute, the game just isn't finished. The guide writers, poor souls that they were, had the distinct pleasure of documenting these leaps of faith. Treetop Village is notorious for its verticality. One minute you're enjoying the view, and the next you're pixel hunting for an opening on a distant rock formation, all while trying not to sneeze lest you misalign the analog stick and tumble into the ether. It really highlights the absurdity of late 90s platforming, doesn't it? The engine was clearly tuned for strafing raptors with a grenade launcher, not for executing millimeter-perfect jumps across the jungle canopy. Yet here we are, expected to treat every twig like a professional gymnastics course. Looking at these shots, with their telltale aggressive yellow scrawls, you can almost hear the grunts of exertion. Back in the day, that crude, hand-drawn ink was the difference between finishing the level and tossing your controller through the screen. If these arrows didn't tell you where the hole was, you were just an idiot running circles around a tree stump until a dinosaur chewed your leg off. Then we migrate to the Lost Land, a moniker that implies we might find something valuable, when in reality, we are just trading one flavor of pain for another. The text calls this level a mixed bag, which is British shorthand for an absolute slog that nobody enjoyed. We're talking about a level defined by precision jumps. Those words alone should make any seasoned N64 veteran shudder. Imagine navigating narrow pillars, in a game with first-person perspective, where depth perception is non-existent, because the hardware is rendering half the scenery in fog, all while being expected to perform parkour. It's like trying to thread a needle while wearing oven mitts during an earthquake. Yet, we persisted. That was the magic of the cartridge era, really. You bought the game, you read the tips, and you tolerated the misery because the alternative was staring at the wall. The search for the Chronoceptor pieces remains the absolute zenith of 90s design masochism, the digital equivalent of burying treasure in your own back garden, and then losing the map. We didn't mind, of course. We convinced ourselves that all this searching for hidden, obscured paths through lava pools was somehow enhancing the journey, rather than just masking the fact that there wasn't all that much game there to begin with. We were content with our muddy textures and our yellow marker pen directions, convinced that the upcoming confrontation, briefly teased at the bottom of the page, would make all the tedious exploration and death-defying jumps worth the hassle. We knew the truth, but we were in too deep to quit now. The next page transports us from the muddy, perilous jungles of dinosaur hunting to the desolate, frostbitten corridors of Hoth, bringing us the inevitable strategy breakdown for Shadows of the Empire. For any N64 owner in '97, this was the game. You didn't buy a console at launch and not have Dash Render's questionable dialogue and slippery walking mechanics clogging up your CRT. The AT-AT section is the star of the show here. We all remember that level, don't we? It was the primary reason to show off the system to anyone who came over. The magazine treats the dogfighting logic with the gravity of a genuine military briefing, which is funny considering most of us spent those levels spinning around uncontrollably while shouting at the screen. Getting those 3 challenge points involved a specific go-ahead flight pattern that required more focus than most school exams. You were meant to pilot like an ace, but reality usually involved spamming the air brake button, flying blindly, and hoping your hook cable caught a walker before you hit the ground in a ball of flame. The level of detail here, explaining where to move the analog stick to successfully trip an AT-AT, reads like an instructional manual for a space program. Then we drop inside the Echo Base. The contrast from the flight sequences is jarring. It's basically a masterclass in how to turn a series of beige corridors into a taxing search mission. You're wandering around in the first-person perspective, squinting at pixelated crates, looking for items hidden away with such malice it would make a dungeon master weep. These guides are honestly lifesavers, mostly because you'd never find these challenge points on your own, without hitting every wall in the base just to check for a glitch or a secret. You spend your time dodging stormtroopers, trying to distinguish between a functional doorway and a wall that's just poorly textured, and looking for ammunition. Finally, we have the bizarre ritual of unlocking the high-level prizes, making players hold a button for 15 seconds like a digital penance for not being a gaming savant, is peak 90s design. It's absolutely crackers that we had to learn specific, game-breaking codes just to make the Wampas friendly. We didn't question the absurdity back then, we just sat there, trigger fingers cramping, committed to the cause of finishing every single challenge point so we could justify that heavy price tag we paid for the cartridge. It was tedious, it was punishing, and it was glorious. The next page shows us that completing a game in 1997 wasn't just a leisure activity, it was essentially a second job requiring a specialized qualification in pixel hunting. We are staring at a granular breakdown of Echo Base and the treacherous scrap heaps of the junkyard, and honestly, seeing these instructional snippets brings back that particular brand of frustration unique to the late 90s. These pages essentially turn Shadows of the Empire into a strict flight manual or a sterile, tactical briefing. You get the sense that if you didn't follow the challenge point route exactly, the game would simply decide you hadn't played it properly. Looking at these tips for the Echo Base and the asteroid field, it is fascinating how the game expected us to explore every nook and cranny while being harassed by stormtroopers and the sheer difficulty of landing jumps. Those images on the page, all jagged polygons and flat textures, capture exactly how we saw the game through our thick, chunky CRT televisions. We thought it looked like the movies, but now, staring at it, you realize it mostly looks like an architectural model built out of soggy cardboard boxes. The instruction to find specific items in the chasm or navigating the train sequence on the right-hand page sounds easy enough in print, but trying to execute those movements on the original controller, with that slightly spongy analog stick, was often like trying to perform keyhole surgery while wearing oven mitts. Then there is the guidance provided for the encounters, particularly the bits concerning the Saint Walkers, and that delightful rogues gallery, specifically the droid IG-88. The magazine gives sage advice about approaching the droid with caution and rapid-fire bursts, which is sweet. Most of us just spent that encounter oscillating between frantic sidestepping and desperate shooting, hoping that our health bar didn't blink out of existence. The guide acts like its military strategy, whereas in practice, survival was usually down to luck and finding the one sweet spot where the enemy's programmed stupidity allowed us to win. These challenge points were the currency of the playground, really. You weren't a proper Star Wars pilot if you hadn't spent your weekend hunting for every last hidden object in that metallic labyrinth. Reading this page is like looking at a ledger for how we burnt our summer holidays, scrutinizing tiny, low-resolution photographs to figure out how to jump onto a platform that clearly wasn't designed for human-controlled movement. It is a time capsule of a generation forced to get good simply because there wasn't an online video to hold our hands. It was rigid, it was often unforgiving, and looking back, we likely wouldn't have bothered putting in that much effort if it hadn't felt like we were breaking into a secret digital bunker just by reaching the end credits. Next, we have more from the exhaustive briefing on Gaul Spaceport. It's essentially the digital equivalent of hunting for loose change down the back of a sofa, only with significantly more hostile aliens trying to remove your spleen. You can tell whoever wrote this guide was desperately trying to make the platforming sound tactical, rather than the clunky collision detection struggle it actually was. Look at those steps. Jet to the first rock. Jump on the series of ledges. Simple on paper, isn't it? On a real console, that analog stick often felt like a loose tooth in an old gum, making those precision platforming sequences a legitimate lesson in anger management. You aren't just playing a game, you're operating heavy machinery with a joystick made of slightly melting butter. And then, the piece de résistance, Boba Fett. The magazine says Rebel intelligence has little to report, which is clearly the polite way of saying, this fight is a complete pain, good luck with that. Following the advice to hunt down pulse ammo instead of just charging in with your laser cannons is sound, tactical logic obviously. But let's be honest, we all treated that encounter like a grim game of hide-and-seek gone wrong. We spent the time poking our heads out from behind the scenery, firing a few frantic shots, and praying that Fett's AI wouldn't decide to turn us into space debris. It is funny looking at these screenshots now. That muddy grey-brown color palette we truly convinced ourselves that was the cutting edge of visual fidelity. It's murky, grim, and looks rather like a wet afternoon in industrial England, but at the time, it felt like the pinnacle of cinematic gaming. As for that sprawling directory of advertisements clogging the right-hand column, those pages were the literal lifelines of the 90s. Before global trade became a trivial matter of clicking a button, you lived or died by these import shops. You would ring up places like Games Mania, Skill, or New Generation consoles with a trembling hand, paying a small fortune just to secure a US-imported game months before your school friends got a look at the European release. It was extortionate, legally grey, and usually required a pass-through adapter, just to stop the console from complaining about the region. But when that parcel arrived with a vibrant North American game box, you felt like you had smuggled a national treasure through customs. It is a lovely little memorial to just how much of our pocket money was funneled directly into the pockets of enterprising shop owners, who figured out that teenagers couldn't wait 3 months for a local shop to finally get some stock on the shelves. The next page pulls us out of those murky space-age corridors and dumps us straight into the vibrant, grass-painted rolling hills of Bobo MB Battlefield. It is absolutely hysterical, when you look at it with modern eyes, just how quickly we decided that Nintendo's crowning masterpiece of platforming exploration shouldn't be about exploring at all. It was meant to be a brisk exercise in geometric abuse. Back when these pages were first inked, nobody was out there preaching, speedrunning, with a digital timer and an emulator-induced sweat. We were just kids trying to figure out how to shave a few seconds off to impress our mates. This guide acts like it's providing military-grade instruction, breaking down King Bobo MB like he's a strategic liability rather than just a big fella waiting to be lobbed. You see these instructions about frame-perfect inputs and utilizing warp zones, and it really drives home how early the break the game mentality truly was. Most of us probably spent half our childhood actually playing Super Mario 64 as Nintendo intended, taking in the sights, listening to that iconic chirpy brass soundtrack, and getting distracted by the giant chomp chain. But here? It's pure clinical extraction. Stand on the flower bed, look left, turn right. It's like we're programming a machine rather than guiding a legendary plumber. And credit where it is due, that design philosophy is part of why the game is legendary. It is one of the few games where you can look at a distant floating platform or a jagged mountain ridge, and your instinct isn't to look for the invisible wall telling you no, but to ask, how much speed do I need to clear that gap? That is genius-level design. Whether it's hitting that floating island cannon to snipe a star from the sky, or exploiting the way Mario can essentially wall jump off anything that resembles a collision box, Nintendo baked that freedom right in. It makes me chuckle looking at these screenshots. We have the text obsessing over the best way to get 70 stars, acting like you're doing taxes, but just look at the character. The way Mario trots around, the sheer delight of the movement system. The N64 controller's analog stick actually made sense here. Unlike the clunky disaster it turned into with flight sims or first-person shooters, the platforming in Super Mario 64 was precision engineered. You felt connected to every hop, skip, and triple jump. The authors of this guide are clearly trying to act as though they've solved a mathematical puzzle, turning the act of collecting gold into an industrial production line. It is perfectly absurd, isn't it? Reading these little columns to learn how to outmaneuver a mindless Goomba in under 5 seconds, just so you could hold the controller for 10 minutes and feel like a wizard. We all lived for that. The next page takes us deeper into the meat of the experience, trading the pastoral charm of the opening hills for the vertigo-inducing verticality of Hump's Fortress and the lonely, sodden depths of Jolly Roger Bay. It's genuinely hilarious reading these tips, as if we're decoding ancient alien ruins. The magazine treats maneuvering through Hump's Fortress like a military tactical strike. The instruction to run in front of a giant sentient block of stone, knowing he's about to flatten you like a pancake just to save a few seconds on a backflip? That's dedication. We weren't just playing games, we were conducting a precise cold-hearted extraction of every possible digitized coin. I recall the absolute frustration of trying to hit that flagpole. The physics could be cruel if you didn't angle your jump correctly, but you have to admit, standing at the summit of that tower, looking down at the floating platforms below, was one of the early eureka moments that proved Mario's movement was vastly superior to anything else available on a console. We weren't tethered to the ground, and that freedom changed our expectations for every 3D platformer that followed. Then there's the transition to Jolly Roger Bay. The music alone, that melancholic, swirling track, was enough to send a chill down your spine. And the eel? Oh, the eel. The writers suggest haggling with the moray, which is a brilliantly polite way to put it, isn't it? I'm sure we all remember the absolute panic of being trapped in that cavern, trying to grab the star while this nightmare of nature's creation did flybys. You didn't haggle with him. You essentially performed a terrified game of ring around the rosy in 4 feet of murky virtual water. It's classic Nintendo putting a horrific, teeth-baring predator in what should have been a relaxing swim, and then you finally secure that star and have to figure out how to clamber back to the surface. It was brilliantly miserable, in the best possible way. And then we reach that right-hand sidebar, the star schedule. Look at this for a moment. It reads like a bureaucratic roadmap to liberation. We've turned an odyssey of discovery into a checklist of tax requirements. It's delightfully absurd, but necessary, wasn't it? Without these pointers, wandering around the castle was a fever dream of doors you couldn't open and paintings you couldn't enter. Hitting the 30, 50 and 70 star marks wasn't just game progress, it was social currency on the playground. If you weren't hitting those targets, you were effectively a pleb, and these pages were the only thing stopping you from looking like a total liability in front of your mates. The efficiency with which we had to hoard stars to open the castle's deeper secret dark world, wingcap, the basement levels demanded a level of systematic ruthlessness that modern tutorials just don't have the audacity to enforce. We weren't exploring, we were auditing the kingdom 1 star at a time, and heaven help anyone who wasted their time on a difficult challenge when an easier one was sitting right there. The next page forces us from the comfort of sunny fields into the biting, treacherous winds of Cool Cool Mountain, before abruptly dumping us into the dark, dusty corners of Big Boo's haunt. We've gone from pleasant jumps to genuine atmospheric tension, and frankly, the difficulty spike for any self-respecting kid was enough to induce a minor heart attack. Cool Cool Mountain is an absolute exercise in frustration masters fun. We all remember the penguins. For some ungodly reason, Mario's primary job description expanded to include the role of unpaid nanny. Fetching that baby penguin, only for the mother to look at us like we've failed a state-mandated audit, was the height of insult. And then there is the slide. The slide was where we learned the cold, hard reality of slippery geometry. The guide mentions making complex jumps while carrying the infant, which is exactly the kind of unhinged micromanagement that makes these older titles such a treat. Why are we launching ourselves over ice partitions with a bird in our hands? Because that is simply the way things were done. The instructions for the snowman assembly read like a manual for high-stakes bomb disposal, except instead of cutting red wires, you are desperately maneuvering around a giant snowhead, praying it doesn't push you off the mountain edge. Then there is the transition to the so-called ghost house, which the rest of us learned was properly called Big Boo's haunt, but why get pedantic? This was our first taste of true darkness in the kingdom. That level felt so moody compared to everything else. You really got the sense that Nintendo wanted us to stop larking about and start looking over our shoulders. Those library shelves in the ghost house, pushing books to satisfy some unseen puzzle master feels utterly ridiculous in hindsight. Imagine breaking into a spectral library just to get a gold star. Yet we did it, and we felt like master code crackers. The magazine's tips on navigating the interior, warning us about those trapdoors, saved countless players from losing their minds to gravity. And don't get me started on the big eyeball detail. The mag goes into detail about that giant staring eye, which genuinely used to unsettle the younger player. Staring back at a disembodied polygon entity that seems to be following your every move, it was the pixelated equivalent of a horror film. These pages, however, serve as a delightful reminder of how much mechanical precision was required. You look at these instructions to perform backflips and precise long jumps on narrow ledges, and it really puts today's tutorials to shame. We weren't getting prompted with glowing waypoints. We were told to go to the attic or find a specific secret area by reading text on a page. The commitment required to execute these movements, frame-perfect landings, aggressive camera management, it turned a brightly colored plumber simulator into a tense, calculated dance. Whether we were slipping on frozen tracks or sprinting from a giant sentient eyeball, we were technically playing better back then because the game refused to care about our comfort levels. And looking at these grainy shots of the attic, it almost makes one want to find the old hardware just to fail that jump into the darkness all over again. This page drops the pretense of charm and forces us to navigate the subterranean gloom of hazy maze cave before flinging us directly into the literal fire pit of the 7th course, charmingly renamed The Sea of Lava by an editor who clearly didn't have to worry about SEO titles. Hazy Maze Cave is essentially a lesson in what it feels like to wander through a damp, industrial basement filled with poison gas and indifferent prehistoric sea creatures. It is atmospheric, sure, but mostly it is claustrophobic. You really get a sense from these tips that the primary objective wasn't platforming, but rather managing your patience. Watching the guide describe riding Nessie like a glorified river barge, you remember the poor thing, looking entirely unimpressed as you stood on its head, brings back memories of precision maneuvering in a tiny restricted space, while a gas meter slowly counted down to your demise. It's proper puzzle design, provided your definition of a puzzle is finding a pixel-perfect hole in a fence before suffocating. The tips regarding the shortcuts, particularly the instruction to wall-kick your way through high ledges to reach areas the developers likely hoped you'd tackle with grace, really highlights how these guides were training us to be speedrunners before the term existed. There's a certain arrogance to it, honestly. Here we are, being shown how to skip the game's actual level design in favor of geometric trickery. It's not just playing the game, it's aggressively nudging it until the collision detection finally relents and lets you through. Then we hit the volcano, and frankly the advice is peak cheeky. They quite blatantly tell us the course is criminally easy if you simply abuse the wing cap. Imagine that ignoring the entire lava platforming challenge just by taking to the skies. It feels less like advice and more like a tactical guide on how to ruin the developers' weekend. And frankly, we loved it. There was no joy quite like circling over the map, avoiding the complex pathing meant to punish clumsy jumping, and dropping in behind the objectives. The instruction about the sliding Bowser puzzle tiles feels like a trip to the Dark Ages. Stand on the shaking tile, hope it lands on the right spot, don't melt into the magma. Simple instructions for a surprisingly anxiety-inducing piece of level architecture. Looking at these images, it's refreshing to see the game stripped down to its cold, hard logic. No long, intrusive dialogue, just, go here, jump there, try not to catch fire. We spent hours mastering these specific movements, training our thumbs to respond to visual cues with absolute precision, all to secure a star tucked away behind a piece of wall that really shouldn't have been passable in the first place. It was brutal, it was exacting, and by God it felt like an accomplishment to make Mario glide into those tight gaps. Looking at this now, it is almost enviable. We had the time and the patience to perfect such ridiculous skills. Today's games would probably pause to teach you how to move your legs. Next up, we've managed to flip the page and stumble right into an editorial identity crisis, where evidently counting to 9 proved a bit too taxing for the folks running the layout department. It seems both the pyramid-dwelling desert level rechristened here with that ominous treacherous sands moniker, and the watery purgatory that is dire docks share the same, Course 8 label. You have to admire that level of steadfast dedication to factual ambiguity. Clearly, double-checking simple numerical sequencing was entirely secondary to ensuring the screenshots of Mario looking mildly distressed were perfectly centered. Moving on to the sands themselves, it is a brilliant exercise in teaching the player to despise architecture. That pyramid was designed with a level of mechanical cruelty in mind. The guide highlights using the wing cap to essentially bypass the entire intended platforming sequence, effectively treating the design as a minor suggestion rather than a requirement. Why bother carefully leaping across precarious ledges when you can simply soar to the ceiling and walk over them like a man possessed? That, quite frankly, was the secret genius of the whole affair. The game offered total liberty to treat its geometry with complete disrespect. That boss fight against Irock the clappy stony nightmare is detailed with a clinical precision that hides the fact that we all likely spent half our childhood getting smashed to smithereens by giant floating stone palms, because we weren't standing in the exact sweet spot for 5 consecutive seconds. Then we wade into the soaking wet depths of dire docks. The mere mention of that submarine brings back that distinct heavy sensation of frustration. Everything in there is dreadfully floaty, the pacing is sluggish, and nothing says, gaming heaven, quite like chasing an elusive coin or a star trigger, while a mechanical vessel slowly circles the room like an incredibly depressed steel shark. The advice provided here, suggesting players execute a triple jump or a precise wall kick, is presented with the bold assumption that you've somehow developed superhuman reflexes while treading water. And then there is the talk of speedrun techniques, skipping entire sections by hopping over low barriers, which proves that even in 1997, the staff realized the only proper way to enjoy these levels was to systematically break them. It is almost amusing that the best time section is featured here, essentially taunting players with a record that felt absolutely impossible to achieve at the time. The instructions demand you act with ruthless speed, particularly regarding Bowser's little submarine incident, telling you to run in and snatch the star before he even breathes. It is the sort of advice that assumes you have nothing better to do than turn a pleasant plumber platformer into a cold, efficient production line of stolen goods. The next page drags us into the fabled Nintendo hotline. Before every single query, FAQ, and glitch demonstration was uploaded to a video site by some bright spark on the other side of the planet, we actually had to phone a premium rate number and beg some stranger for game answers. It really is a quaint window into 1997, when getting a hint required serious pocket money commitment, and the distinct possibility of being scolded by your parents for a soaring telephone bill. The folks at the hotline office were the unsung, likely undercaffeinated heroes of the industry, sitting in some grey cubicle, guiding people through levels they probably wished they never had to look at again. We find ourselves back in Super Mario 64 territory. There's something undeniably pathetic about having to ring a specialist hotline to find a star in the desert, or work out how to squeeze into that igloo on Snowman's Land. One has to admire the honesty though. The level design in the latter stages, while masterfully intricate, certainly wasn't beyond occasionally baffling us, especially when we were collectively navigating a 3D space for the first time. The instructions provided are wonderfully matter-of-fact, lacking any of the gaming journalist fluff we'd get these days, just pure, cold logic. Get on top of the structure, jump off, don't die. It's beautifully stark. The same applies to the Shadows of the Empire advice. If you ever actually played that on the N64, you know exactly why people needed help. Controlling those vehicles, and maneuvering against enemies like a -TS and EG-88, felt about as graceful as steering a tank through a puddle. It was one of the launch-era titles that kept us hooked on pure license hype, while the gameplay mechanics were still learning how to exist on this hardware. Hearing about needing to execute a precise calculated strategy just to not be shredded by a droid really underlines why some of us felt like we needed a helping hand back then. As for that side panel filled with Killer Instinct Gold and Mortal Kombat Trilogy secrets, that's where the real power dynamic lived. Knowing how to access the hidden menus to tweak match settings wasn't just a bonus, it was how you established dominance. You'd carefully scribble these button sequences into your notebook, reciting the fatalities, like ancient, violent poetry. It's hilarious to think about now, but manually inputting these strings of code before a match began was a ritual. If you messed up the input, you didn't get your character, you just got smashed a digital punishment for having butterfingers. It was the arcade spirit preserved in a home console, just a bit clunkier, and significantly harder to execute when the pressure was on. Next we have the Pioneer Tips Extra, Page-a-Funks, a delightfully archaic portal to a time before we could just stream a walkthrough. Back in '97, extracting tips from a magazine like this felt less like reading and more like conducting a clandestine operation, sending in a physical coupon to potentially see your own name in ink for sharing a tip about Turok or Super Mario 64. That was the digital clout of the era, and honestly, it felt arguably more prestigious than racking up followers today. The focus here is heavily skewed toward those titles that kept us tinkering. Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey and J-League Perfect Striker offered that specific niche appeal. Who actually remembers wrestling with the menus in those import sports titles? You'd spend hours laboring over team stats and jersey colors, just for the glory of simulating a perfect season. It was essentially glorified spreadsheet management, but the level of granular control made you feel like you were breaking the game. As for the Turok, Dinosaur Hunter cheats provided, granting yourself infinite ammo for a title where navigating platforms often felt like steering a hovercraft on a sheet of ice, was less of a cheat and more of a mandatory quality of life requirement. It's rather sweet, looking back at these instructions for specific Mario Kart shortcuts, or how to force your players into having massive heads in J-League Perfect Striker. It highlights a certain devotion that seems almost alien now, when having the inside scoop on a hidden game code or a tricky movement trick made you the absolute, undisputed king of the playground. It wasn't about being good at the game, it was about knowing the hidden variables. The next page is Club 64, an editorial clearinghouse where the readership comes to vent their frustrations about import costs or fawn over the latest Mario titles. It's a classic 90s spread, featuring a collection of missives where folks argue over the absolute daylight robbery that was British video game pricing back then. Seriously, looking at some of these letters, you'd think the pound was being traded solely for cartridges and peripherals, and honestly, for most of us, it probably was. There is the perennial argument regarding console acquisition. Some readers are rightfully pondering whether the N64 justifies the floor space next to the Sony PlayStation, a valid debate considering the vastly different libraries. But then again, looking at the vibrant, clean polygons of Super Mario 64, the answer was usually yes, before the machine even finished booting up. One reader agonizes over a purchasing dilemma. Should it be Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, or Wave Race 64? While Turok had that undeniable grit and technical clout, Wave Race 64 arguably offered better water physics than games released a decade later. It was a golden age of indecision, really. Then there is the "So Tell Me This" column, the magazine's attempt to mitigate the massive headache-inducing confusion regarding controller packs and the erratic nature of N64 save files. It addresses the fervent excitement surrounding Star Fox 64, a title the UK was properly frothing at the mouth for. People weren't just anticipating the game, they were obsessed with the incoming Rumble Pack. Imagine a world where the idea of a controller shivering in your palms was treated like a miracle of modern science. It's quaint, really, seeing folks genuinely fret about battery usage and memory slots, as if they were maintaining a fleet of airliners. Rounding out the page is the "I'm the Best" leaderboard, featuring those valiant few who decided that setting time trial records on Mario Kart 64 was a better use of their limited time on Earth than, say, a brisk walk or perhaps socializing. The devotion to shave mere fractions of a second off a lap of the Mushroom Cup is frankly absurd, yet weirdly admirable. Whether it was the speed on Super Mario 64, or specific kart shortcuts, the competitive fire of the era wasn't fueled by global leaderboards, just a printed name in a magazine, which at the time, felt like ascending to the pantheon of gods. The frustration in these letters about UK-specific console taxes remains the real, lingering memory here. That stinging realization that our island was effectively paying a premium just for the privilege of being part of the future. The next page is our directory of shame and glory, essentially the N64's report card during its early, wildly uneven life. It's a sobering reality check when you consider that dropping 60 quid on a cartridge back then was a significant financial investment, akin to a week's food budget or, if you were a teenager, selling a kidney on the black market just to secure the latest imports. Looking through the UK section is like watching a car crash in slow motion next to a pristine statue of excellence. We all collectively remember the sheer, unadulterated perfection of Super Mario 64. It earned that 96% rating by essentially redefining what 3D gaming could do before other developers even got out of bed. Then, staring right back at it with a shameful 39%, is FIFA 64. That game remains a masterclass in how to take a global sporting phenomenon and make it feel as sluggish and painful as trudging through deep mud. It's an affront that it shares a page with Wave Race 64, which still holds up remarkably well today. Those water physics were the closest we got to magic. You didn't just race, you sculpted waves with an analog stick while everything else at the time looked like it was driving over sheets of painted plywood. Then you have the Blosser import category, which served as our gateway to either brilliance or absolute buyer's remorse. Blastcore is the standout gem here, the thinking person's demolition simulator. If you didn't spend a Saturday morning frantically trying to steer a runaway dump truck through a suburb just to satisfy some unspoken need to flatten buildings, you genuinely missed out on a pillar of 90s gaming excellence. It's pure, rare era joy. Contrasting that to the duds, and my word were there some stinkers, look at Cruisin' USA. It crawled onto the screen with a brutal 34% review score, and deservedly so. We wanted the arcade experience, and we got a watered-down, ugly port that felt like the developers were actively holding a grudge against the N64 hardware. And let's not overlook the Japanese import lottery, represented by titles like The Glory of St. Andrews and Mahjong Master. Imagine parting with massive sums of import tax cash to receive a golf game with clunky 16-bit era graphics, or a digital version of mahjong that made about as much sense as ancient hieroglyphics without a Japanese phrasebook glued to your hand. This list is a testament to the fact that, back in the early days of the N64, we were absolutely ravenous for content. We would gamble our money on almost anything, just for a new experience, leading to the bizarre juxtaposition of masterpieces sitting right beside digital landfill. It was a simpler, albeit much more expensive time, where a low score was a tragedy, and a high one felt like a ticket to a better dimension. Next, we find ourselves drifting through the remains of the directory, sorting through a pile of software that really shouldn't be occupying the same shelf space. Let's start with the crown jewel, Mario Kart 64. 91%. Honestly, that score almost feels too low given the immense damage to friendships this game has caused. It was, and quite rightly still is, the single most important purchase any N64 owner ever made. You didn't just play it, you lived it. It turned casual weekend gatherings into blood feuds, involving nothing more than slippery yellow fruit and well-placed projectiles, establishing a gold standard that no other racer on the console ever quite matched. If you weren't launching a red shell in the final stretch just to witness the pure, unadulterated panic on your mate's face, what were you actually doing with your childhood? On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we've got Mortal Kombat Trilogy staring back with a woeful 34%. Whoever reviewed this was feeling remarkably charitable, to say the least. It's less of a game and more of a technical glitch exhibition, like watching a bunch of sprites having an identity crisis in a mirror factory. It took a legendary fighting franchise and essentially dragged its face through the mud, making you question why you bothered firing it up in the first place. A total embarrassment that deserves to be left in the darkest corner of the memory bank. Then we have the mid-table mediocrity of NBA Hang Time at 52% and the surprise delight of Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey at 70%. Honestly, hockey on the console was unexpectedly frantic fun, capturing a kinetic, high-speed energy that most sports titles managed to completely squander. Hang Time, meanwhile, felt a bit confused, like someone desperately trying to make the sport look extreme for a generation obsessed with baggy jeans and pop punk. As for Wonder Project J2, there it sits with a shrug of a score, 55%. The charm was obvious, everything looked genuinely delightful, but we hit that classic, unavoidable roadblock of the era. Unless you spent your youth secretly studying Japanese, the whole plot sailed right over your head. We all wanted to be those sophisticated import gamers, acting like we were part of an exclusive club, only to spend 4 hours completely lost in a text-heavy menu that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Staring at this list of publisher contact numbers back before Google meant you didn't have to speak to a human being to find out a release date, really reminds you of how different things were. It's almost sweet, in a primitive, archaic way, isn't it? Having to keep a list of phone numbers like you're trying to book a taxi. We had to earn our frustration in the late 90s, and frankly, reading these entries confirms that frustration was a cheap, abundant commodity for all of us early adopters. Grab an N64 Magazine subscription here, save 33% on the cover price, and have all your gaming insights and reviews delivered directly to your door instead of trailing around high street shops. The next page shifts gears entirely, deciding that before we bury ourselves any further into release dates and high-score boards, it's worth taking a look at the actual foundation of the firm keeping us occupied. They call the feature From Cards to Carts, which is a neat way of summarizing a transition that sounds utterly bizarre if you stop and think about it. A 100-year-old Japanese playing card business managing to pivot successfully enough to effectively dictate the trajectory of our hobby. There is something objectively brilliant about the fact that the same company which spent the late 19th century churning out Hanafuda cards is the one that ushered us into the third dimension with a jumping Italian plumber. That image of someone holding a classic grey widescreen game and watch device, that specific, stubborn ancestor of the modern portable, serves as the perfect visual reminder of where we came from. Those single-screen LCD nightmares were the proving ground for many. If you could tolerate the stiff controls and limited movement of a game and watch, the move to a 3D joystick was a revelation, even if it took most of us an embarrassingly long time to stop bumping into every single wall in the castle grounds. The article takes a moment to address the absolute cold sweat terror that was the market landscape in the late 90s. It was a proper dogfight out there, wasn't it? You had Nintendo sitting on their 64-bit throne, frantically fending off the creeping neon-lit menace of Sony and the ever-aggressive Sega, who were both treating our living rooms like an open battlefield. The editorial raises a genuine point, asking how Nintendo maintained the #1 spot while rivals were lobbing every technological distraction at the consumer base. It hits the nail on the head regarding the brand recognition of the era too. Back then, Nintendo was used as a generic noun for all video games, much like how every Hoover on the market is mistakenly called a Hoover by people who haven't updated their vocabulary in 30 years. It captures the spirit of the time, documenting that unique, almost possessive, cultural grip the company held over players. It wasn't necessarily about the raw numbers on a spec sheet, but about that persistent ability to engineer gaming nirvana, even when the rest of the world was seemingly obsessed with disk drives and edgy marketing campaigns that were trying too hard to sell gaming to people who went to nightclubs. It is a fairly candid retrospective on how a century-old entity avoided the inevitable slow death of obsolescence. Seeing them trace the legacy from Fusajiro Yamauchi to the N64 powerhouse confirms just how unusual this success story actually is. We're left considering that we were just incredibly lucky they didn't decide to stick to selling playing cards instead of giving us some of the finest electronic entertainment we've ever experienced. The next page continues the deep dive into the corporate machinery that kept us all chained to our tellies, with a spread titled, Inside Nintendo's Game Heads. It is frankly the kind of article you might skim past while frantically looking for cheat codes. But given we are sitting here in 1997, and Nintendo is the deity we all worship, I suppose a history lesson on their truly bizarre transition is actually necessary. The magazine is practically tripping over itself to showcase Nintendo's greatest hits, and their absolutely catastrophic failures in equal measure. And honestly, citing the Virtual Boy in that list of biggest failures is entirely deserved. Whoever thought a portable red and black head-mounted screen that caused near-instant migraines would be a top-tier Christmas gift needs their head examined. It is almost amusing looking back at things like the Power Glove or the R.OB. Accessory. It serves as a blunt reminder that for every masterpiece like Super Mario 64, there was some boardroom genius deciding that we desperately needed peripherals that functioned like clumsy, glorified party tricks. What the feature really tries to unpick is how they managed to pivot from, wait for it, Hanafuda cards and owning the Odd Love Hotel, a polite way of putting sketchy isn't it, to being the absolute architects of our living room entertainment. They trot out names like Hiroshi Yamauchi, Masayuki Uemura, and the late legend Gunpei Yokoi. It is actually staggering to think that without a fellow like Yokoi having the spark to repurpose basic toy technology, we might never have even reached the starting line of the home console boom. It highlights the difference in philosophy perfectly. While the industry rivals were obsessing over who could pack the most raw power and edgy marketing campaigns into a box, Miyamoto was treating game design like he was painting a portrait. That's the real kicker here. The article argues that while Nintendo was playing catch-up on specs, they were miles ahead on the fun quotient. They didn't win by fighting a ground war with brute force. They won by engineering a specific brand of digital magic that the other chaps, no matter how many polygon-pushing features they boasted, just couldn't replicate. There is a hefty dose of swagger to the whole article, claiming that Nintendo had become a synonym for gaming itself, much like people refer to every vacuum cleaner as a Hoover. It is a bit arrogant perhaps, but back in the day, we weren't going to argue. When you had an N64 controller, firmly gripped in both hands, feeling the analog stick react with precision, the corporate history didn't matter. You just knew that the seal of quality on the cartridge box usually meant you wouldn't be returning it to the shop for a refund the next morning. The little timeline at the bottom is a cracking summary, proving that if a company can survive a century of selling paper playing cards before switching to lasergun technology and electronic plumbers, they are doing something right. It's an informative bit of reading for the self-professed console historians, but ultimately it just reaffirms that despite the occasional PR disaster like the Virtual Boy, Nintendo's grip on the industry is fairly deserved. Still, I prefer playing the titles rather than pondering the boardroom meetings that birthed them. The next page finds us cornering Shigeru Miyamoto for a bit of a grilling on, well, everything that defines our lives in 1997. If the previous articles haven't already hammered home that this man is essentially royalty within our hobby, this spread of interviews certainly finishes the job. He offers his take on the industry, like he is sat in a high-backed velvet armchair, observing ants scurrying around an anthill, entirely unfazed by the commercial madness that typically drives developers into early retirement. Reading his thoughts on cartridges versus grades is like catching a glimpse of a cold, calculated masterstroke. While the rest of the market was caught in a frenzied hysteria about how many gigabytes they could cram onto a disc for long-winded bloated cutscenes, Shigeru stayed perfectly content with his fast-loading plastic bricks. History has, of course, vindicated his choice. We weren't playing to watch cinematic movies, were we? We wanted the responsive, tight gameplay that made the analog stick of the N64 controller, the singular, defining accessory of our teenage years. Hearing him discuss the 3D transition as if it were a casual design choice as opposed to the sheer witchcraft it clearly took to actually execute, really underscores the gap between Nintendo and the rest of the world. When the conversation veers into his competition and his views on foreign developers, the gloves effectively come off. It is delivered with that deceptively soft-spoken, diplomatic politeness that is, frankly, far more cutting than an outright insult. He basically characterizes his competition as obsessed with mimicking success rather than fostering it, suggesting they were missing the pulse of the player entirely. The specific comment about British developers our lot, no less, is quite fascinating. He notes an appreciation for our distinct workflow, likely because we were occasionally messy, ambitious, and arguably unhinged in our pursuit of something fresh, which stands in stark contrast to the boardroom-managed sludge he critiques in the wider, desperate-to-imitate industry. It is impossible not to get caught up in the polished, legendary image the magazine paints here. He treats the concept of good design like a delicate art project, claiming he treats it more like painting a portrait than a spreadsheet exercise. To think of Super Mario 64, a game many of us have spent countless weekends playing until our thumbs were bruised, as a work of refined craftsmanship rather than a generic software product, is the exact sort of thing that keeps this brand cemented in our brains. Even that quick, condensed history lesson at the bottom tracing the trajectory from humble card games to toy-like electronics, and finally to the Famicom serves as a brutal reminder of how fast we've all arrived in this new, textured era. It chronicles the journey from simply jumping over barrels to mastering the Z-axis, a timeline that feels surprisingly rapid. Miyamoto speaks with the air of a man who knows exactly what buttons to push to keep us all occupied, and considering most of us haven't looked at a competitor's machine in weeks, he is certainly not wrong. The next page pulls us into an existential dissection of why Nintendo's portfolio managed to hook an entire generation, while the wider industry tried its level best to sell us, well, less impressive alternatives. It's essentially a piece of propaganda disguised as a philosophical deep dive, aimed squarely at justifying why everyone should ignore the alluring promise of PlayStation's endless FMV cutscenes and stick to the pure, uncut responsiveness of a plastic cartridge. The article breaks the Nintendo magic down into tidy, digestible headings: character, playability, surprise, and variety. It starts with an almost comical reverence for Mario. One has to admire how they frame a mascot, essentially a glorified, dungaree-wearing construction worker, as some sort of transcendent cultural icon who avoids the feeble attempts at cool that were plaguing the gaming scene at the time. You know exactly the type. Developers everywhere were scrambling to create a mascot with a chewed, spinning spikes and sunglasses, just begging to be liked. Meanwhile, Mario just stayed put, content with jumping on things. The writing highlights that while the competition viewed their mascots as interchangeable marketing puppets, Nintendo treated them as fixtures of a landscape, like the furniture in one's own front room. When the text shifts to playability, it gets quite protective of the hardware. The writers delve into the ergonomics, and yes, it's high praise for the humble D-pad. They discuss that Nintendo thumb, a condition most of us acquired not through malice, but through the obsessive pursuit of perfection. There's a sharp observation here, that the input method is everything. They argue that where other companies shoved complex controller schemes at the player, expecting us to learn a new language just to walk in a straight line, Nintendo built the machine to mimic the intent. That section on hidden mechanics like the invisible block, or the gentle nudges in the design, perfectly captures why playing Super Mario 64 felt like sorcery. When one pressed forward, Mario moved instantly, with the nuance of a ballerina on speed. That tight integration of hand to controller to screen, they argue, is the dividing line between Nintendo and everyone else struggling to manage 3 dimensions without tripping over their own assets. The analysis of variety and surprise touches upon how these games resisted the rot of repetition. It makes a fair point regarding the transition into 3D. The piece touches on how other titles would try to overwhelm the player with bits, while Nintendo's designers seem to approach things with a refined minimalism, introducing new gadgets or skills precisely when the brain started to zone out. They treat these games like classic literature. Zelda titles weren't just maps to traverse, they were masterclasses in environmental storytelling, where every dungeon served as a surprise rather than a chore list. Interspersed throughout this breakdown are little case studies on classics, like Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, and Super Mario Kart. It is classic magazine filler, sure, but it reinforces the theme. These games weren't just titles one played to burn an hour. They were cultural markers that raised the bar. While the editors act like high-minded critics analyzing the fine arts, one gets the impression that even they are struggling to suppress a giddy grin when discussing the leaps in design that moved us from simple jumping games on the NES to the wide free-roaming expanse of Super Mario 64. It is a convincing read, provided one is already a fan of the machine. Whether it would sway the heathen owning a console that makes one wait 40 seconds to load a texture is debatable, but for us it is just preaching to the converted in the best way possible. Next, we find ourselves scanning the horizon with the impatience of a bored teenager, dissecting the menu for what's supposedly hitting the shelves in issue 3. It's an exercise in anticipation, treating the forthcoming releases like an itinerary for an impending crusade against our free time. Front and center is Star Fox 64, naturally. We've been eyeing up those barrel rolls since the announcement, though let's be honest, the true thrill here isn't the dogfighting. It's the distinct challenge of keeping Slippy Toad, that amphibian disaster, alive long enough to actually contribute something other than pathetic radio pleas. The sheer pressure of the Lilat Wars, coupled with that little vibrating pack attachment, promised a level of immersion that actually justified the price tag. When you're banking an R-wing into a narrow trench with the controller buzzing like an angry hornet in your hands, the rest of the world genuinely does fade into irrelevance. Then there is International Superstar Soccer 64. Now, before the sports fanatics get rowdy, credit where it's due. This title arguably did for the pitch what Super Mario 64 did for the 3D plane. It made the action move with an intuitive fluidity we just hadn't seen. While other sports sims felt like directing actors in a play who had forgotten their lines, this was properly snappy. It made a mockery of real-world football, where half the players are seemingly incapable of trapping a ball without it ballooning into row Z. Konami understood that the digital version should, frankly, be better than the real thing. Doom 64 lurks in the preview pile as well. They stripped out the vibrant, almost cheerful blood-red chaos of the PC originals and replaced it with this heavy, suffocating, moody atmosphere. It wasn't a straight port, it was a reimagining for a system that thrived on rendering oppressive, alienating 3D environments. It felt tighter, slower, and significantly more lethal. A grand exercise in jump scares for anyone daring to play with the lights off. As for the periphery, we've got mentions of Killer Instinct Gold and the usual suspects like Power Pro Baseball and Mahjong. Killer Instinct. It looks sharp, undeniably shiny, but one suspects it's the sort of experience that demands a frantic thumbs off to actually achieve anything resembling success. As for the niche imports, they're effectively for the committed collector, or perhaps the bored masochist who doesn't mind passing through kanji manuals for an hour before figuring out how to play a hand. Regarding the rather intrusive full-page spread for Special Reserve, they're there, they're cashing out on the excitement, and they're demanding your bank details for the privilege of keeping your collection complete. It is the brutal, unavoidable tax on our digital consumption. Essentially, if you wanted the goods before your mates, you handed over the wedge. Nothing more, nothing less.